I had been running long-haul freight through the southern Appalachians for almost 15 years when it happened, and in those 15 years I had built up the kind of routine that long-haul drivers build up, the kind that lets you cover 600 miles of bad road in a night and not think about any of it the next morning. I drove for a small regional company out of Roanoke, hauling mostly mixed freight on a route that took me down through southern West Virginia, across into eastern Kentucky, and back up through Tennessee. I knew every truck stop on that route. I knew which exits had decent coffee and which ones had bathrooms you would only use if you absolutely had to. I knew the names of the dispatchers at every yard I delivered to. My wife at home in Roanoke had stopped expecting me on any particular night by about year 3, and we had worked out a kind of marriage that ran on the long phone calls I made from the cab when the road was straight and the radio was low. We had a daughter who was 12 in October of 2014, and she was the reason I worked the hours I did. The road I want to tell you about runs through a stretch of southern West Virginia that I will not name, because I have come to feel that the road is something I would rather not point anybody toward. It is a 2-lane state highway that cuts through a section of the national forest there, and it serves as a shortcut between 2 larger routes for drivers who know it. The shortcut saves about 40 minutes. I had been taking it for years. The road climbs out of a river valley through a long wooded grade, almost 12 miles of slow ascent through hardwood forest, with no houses on it and no shoulder to speak of, and no cell service for most of the way up. At the top of the grade, the road levels out and runs through about 6 miles of open farmland before dropping down into the next valley. I had driven the grade in every kind of weather, in every kind of season, at every hour of the day and night, and I had never thought twice about it. It was late October of 2014, a little after 2 in the morning, and the temperature outside was somewhere in the low 40s. The leaves had turned and were mostly down by then, and the woods on either side of the road had that bare quality you get in late fall, where you can see deeper into the trees than you can in summer. I was 80 miles into a quiet run, hauling pallets of bottled water down to a distributor in Pikeville. The cab was warm. The radio was on a station out of Beckley playing old country, soft enough that it was more company than listening. I had a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. I had eaten a sandwich about an hour back at a pull-off, and I was, in the small, contented way of a man who has been doing his job for a long time, comfortable. I started up the grade just past 2. The headlights pushed out into the dark, and the trees came up on both sides, and the asphalt unrolled in front of me at a steady 45 miles an hour. The road has a long, lazy curve about 3 miles into the climb, and I took it the way I had taken it 1,000 times, leaning slightly into the seat. After the curve, the road straightens out for almost a mile, through a section where the trees are particularly close on both sides. And that mile is the section I want to tell you about, because that is where my headlights caught her. She was standing in the middle of the road. She was facing away from me. She was wearing a long dark coat that came almost to her ankles, the kind of coat you might see on an older woman in church, wool or heavy cotton, dark in the headlights. Her hair was long and dark and hung straight down her back. She was perfectly still. She was not walking. She was not turning. She was simply standing there in the middle of my lane with her back to me, the way a person stands when they are waiting for something. I braked hard. The truck was loaded heavy and the brakes took longer to bite than I wanted them to, and I felt the trailer push behind me the way a loaded trailer pushes when you stop it fast. By the time I had come to a full stop, the road in front of me was empty. The headlights were on the same stretch of asphalt where she had been standing, and there was nothing there. No woman, no coat, no shape stepping off into the trees. The road was simply empty. I sat in the cab with the engine idling. The radio was still playing, very softly, somebody singing about a town in Texas. I did not move for a long time. I checked my mirrors. I checked the sides of the road in the spill of my headlights. I checked the trees. I waited for somebody to step out of the woods, somebody to walk back into the road, somebody to come up to my window and tap on the glass. Nobody did. After about 3 minutes, I let the truck creep forward. That was when I heard the sound. It was footsteps in the gravel on the shoulder of the road, on the passenger side of my truck. The shoulder there is narrow, maybe 3 feet of loose gravel between the asphalt and the drop-off into the trees, and the footsteps were on that gravel, very close to the cab. They were slow. They were even. They were deliberate. They were the footsteps of somebody walking at a normal pace, the way you would walk down a sidewalk on a quiet afternoon, except that I was rolling forward in a loaded semi at about 15 miles an hour, and the footsteps were keeping perfect pace with me. I want to tell you what that sounded like, exactly. The cab of a Peterbilt at 15 miles an hour is not a quiet place. There is the engine. There is the rumble of the tires on asphalt. There is the soft creak of the trailer behind you. And underneath all of that, on the passenger side of my truck, in the gravel of the shoulder, there were the footsteps. They were not loud. They were not soft. They were exactly as loud as the footsteps of a person walking on gravel 3 feet from your shoulder. They were close enough that I could hear the small shift of each stone under each step. I rolled my window up. I had not been driving with it down, but I rolled it up anyway, the way you do something with your hands when your hands need to do something. I turned the radio off. I put both hands on the wheel. I did not look out the passenger side window. I have thought, many times in the years since, about why I did not look. I think it was because I had already understood, in the part of my brain that understands things before the rest of me has caught up, that whatever was on the shoulder beside me was not a thing I wanted to see in the spill of my own running lights. I sped up. I took the truck up to 30. The footsteps sped up. They kept the same even pace, the same deliberate placement, but faster, the way a person speeds up to keep alongside a slow car. I took the truck up to 40. The footsteps stayed with me. I took it up to 50, which was faster than I had any business going on that grade with a loaded trailer, and the footsteps stayed with me. The same slow, even pace, somehow, at 50 miles an hour, in the gravel 3 feet from my passenger door. I slowed. I took the truck back down to 30. The footsteps slowed with me. I took it down to 20. They slowed. I took it down to 10. They slowed. They never fell behind. They never gained. They walked beside my truck at whatever pace I was driving, the way a person walks beside a horse they are leading. There was a moment, somewhere around mile 6 of the grade, when I thought about stopping. I thought about putting the truck in park and getting out and walking around to the passenger side and seeing what was there. I have thought about that decision many times. I think the only reason I am here to tell you this story is that I did not stop. Something in me, the same part of me that had not looked out the window, knew that stopping was not what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to keep driving. I was supposed to keep my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road and keep climbing the grade until the grade ended. The grade is 12 miles long. I had seen her at about mile 1. The footsteps started at about mile 1.5. From mile 1.5 to mile 12, for 11 miles of 2-lane through the dark of a national forest in southern West Virginia, somebody walked beside my truck on the gravel of the shoulder. I do not know who she was. I do not know what she wanted. I do not know whether she had been walking that grade for a long time before me, or whether she walked it only that night. I know that for 11 miles I drove with my hands tight on the wheel and my radio off and my window up, and I know that the small, even sound of footsteps on gravel was the loudest thing I have ever heard in a truck cab in 15 years of driving. About a mile from the top of the grade, I started to pray. I am not a particularly religious man. My wife is. My daughter, at 12, was just starting to get curious about it. I had driven her to Sunday school a few times that fall when my wife had been working weekend shifts. I started praying the way I had heard my wife pray, in small, careful sentences, asking for nothing in particular, only acknowledging that something was listening. I prayed for the last mile of the grade. The footsteps stayed with me. I crested the top of the grade at about 2:30. The road leveled out. The trees fell away on both sides, and the open farmland came up, dark fields under a thin moon, the silhouettes of barns and silos in the distance. The shoulder widened. The gravel turned to the packed dirt of a wider rural road, and the footsteps stopped. They did not fade. They did not trail off. They stopped, in a single instant, the way a recording stops when somebody pulls the plug. One moment they were beside my cab in the gravel. The next moment they were not. The cab of the Peterbilt was suddenly very loud with the sound of the engine, because there was no longer anything else to listen to. I drove the next 40 miles to Pikeville without turning the radio back on. I drove with both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. I did not stop at the rest area I usually stopped at. I did not stop until I got to the distributor. I unloaded my freight at the distributor's dock at 5 in the morning, and the foreman there asked me if I was all right, and I told him I was tired. and he gave me a cup of coffee and let me sit in his office for an hour before I drove the rest of the way home. I called my dispatcher that afternoon and I told him I would not be taking the shortcut anymore. He asked me why. I told him I did not have a good reason, only that I was not going to take it. He was a decent man. He did not push me. He routed me around the long way after that, and we lost the 40 minutes. And I made up the time in other places, and within a few months it was simply how I drove. I have not been on that grade since October of 2014. I have not driven that road in any direction. I am 58 years old now. I retired from long haul 2 years ago. My daughter is 23. My wife and I have settled into the small, comfortable life of older people who have raised their child and are starting to think about being grandparents. I do not, often, think about the woman in the long, dark coat. There are months when she does not come into my mind at all. But every once in a while, late at night, when I am awake for no good reason and the house is quiet, I will hear the heat kick on through the vents, or the refrigerator cycle, or the small settling of a wooden house in the cold. And for an instant, the sound will become the sound of footsteps in gravel, slow and even and deliberate, 3 feet from my shoulder. And in that instant, I will be back in the cab of the Peterbilt, climbing a grade in southern West Virginia at 2 in the morning in October of 2014, with my hands tight on the wheel, and I will think about how I never looked out the passenger side window and how grateful I am that I never looked, and how, even now, I am not entirely sure that whatever walked beside my truck that night ever actually stopped at the top of the grade. I am only sure that I stopped hearing it. And I have come to believe, in the long, quiet years since, that those are not always the same thing. In the summer of 2009, I was 26 years old and working the overnight shift at a paper mill about 15 miles outside Asheville, on the kind of 2-shift schedule that takes a young man's body and breaks it down a little at a time without his noticing. I had been at the mill for almost 3 years by then. I had grown up in a small town in the mountains of western North Carolina, about 40 minutes from Asheville, on the kind of rural roads that most people never have a reason to drive. And after I had washed out of community college, I had taken the job at the mill, the way most of the young men in my family had taken jobs at the mill, because the pay was steady and the hours were consistent, and because in our county there were not very many other things for a young man to do. My father had worked at the same mill for 31 years before he died of a heart attack at 54. He had died about 6 years before the night I want to tell you about. I had been close to him in a way that most boys in our county were close to their fathers, which is to say that we had not talked very much about anything that mattered, and that I had loved him in a quiet way, and that I had thought about him every day since he had been buried. The night in question was a Tuesday in late June. I had finished my shift at 3 in the morning, had clocked out, had eaten a small breakfast of biscuits and coffee in the break room with a couple of the other men, and had gotten into my pickup truck a little after 3:30. The pickup was a 1996 Ford Ranger that had belonged to my father. I had inherited it. The cab smelled like him still, in a faint way that I had stopped noticing in any conscious way, but that I felt in my chest every time I climbed in. The bench seat was the original cloth, worn through in 2 spots from his work pants. The dashboard lights had been replaced once before he died, and they cast a soft greenish glow over the cab at night that I had always liked. I had a choice of routes home. The fast route was the 4-lane that ran from the mill back toward my town, about 40 minutes if traffic was light. The long route was a county road that branched off about 2 miles from the mill and wound through tobacco fields and old farmsteads and the occasional patch of woods, taking close to an hour. I took the long route maybe 2 or 3 nights a week. I took it because it was quiet, because the road was empty at that hour, because the country it ran through was the country I had grown up in and the country my father had grown up in, and because driving it felt like a small, private way of being with him. There was a stretch of the road, about 10 miles in, where the asphalt rose over a low rise, and you could see, in daylight, the steeple of the small Methodist church where my father was buried. I always slowed down at that rise. I had never been able to make myself stop. It was a little before 4 in the morning when I came over that rise. The sky was the pale blue-black it gets just before dawn, the color the world goes when the night is almost over but the sun has not started to make itself felt yet. The tobacco fields on either side of the road were dark and still, There was a thin mist hanging in the low places between the fields, the way mist hangs in summer in the Appalachians, soft and patchy and slow to move. The air through my open window was cool and smelled of cut hay and damp earth. I had the radio off. I had been driving for almost 20 minutes without seeing another car. About 6 miles from my house, on a straight stretch where the road ran between two long tobacco fields, my headlights caught a man walking along the shoulder with his thumb out. He was thin. He was wearing dark work clothes, the kind of dark blue work shirt and dark pants that men in our county had been wearing to factory jobs for 100 years. He had a small dark cap pushed back on his head. He was walking the way a man walks at the end of a long day, with the slow, stiff gait of a man whose feet hurt. His thumb was out. He did not turn his head when my headlights hit him. He just kept walking, slowly, with his thumb pointed back the way he had come. I do not pick up hitchhikers. My father had told me, when I was 16, and he had taught me to drive, that I was never to pick up a man on the side of a country road, no matter how harmless he looked, no matter what the hour was, no matter what kind of weather he was caught in. He had told me that there were things in our county that wore the shapes of harmless men, and that the only way to keep them where they belonged was to drive past them. He had been a serious man about a small number of things, and that had been one of them. But there was something about the way the man walked. There was something about the small, stiff way he was carrying himself, the way his shoulders were set, the way the cap was pushed back on his head. I have thought about it many times in the years since, and I still cannot tell you what it was exactly. It was not that he looked like my father. He did not. My father had been a heavier man, a man with broad shoulders and a slight stoop. The man on the side of the road was thinner, with a different build entirely. It was not a question of resemblance. It was a question of the way he was tired. He was tired the way my father had been tired, at the end of a long shift, walking out to his own pickup in the mill lot. He was tired the way men in our county had always been tired. He was tired the way my father had been tired the last time I had seen him alive, 6 years before, on a Sunday afternoon in his yard, where he had been kneeling next to a flower bed my mother had asked him to weed. I pulled over. I did not think about it. I am not sure, even now, that I made a decision. The truck slowed and came to a stop on the shoulder ahead of him, and I reached over and unlocked the passenger door, and I waited. He climbed in without a word. He pulled the door shut behind him. He settled himself onto the bench seat with the small, stiff care of an older man getting into a vehicle, and he set his hands flat on his thighs, and he looked straight ahead through the windshield. He did not look at me. The cab smelled, faintly, the way it always smelled. The dashboard lights cast their soft greenish glow. He said, in a low Appalachian voice, much obliged, "Could you take me as far as the crossroads at Mill Branch?" I said I could. Mill Branch was about 4 miles up the road from where I had picked him up, at an intersection where the county road crossed a smaller road that ran down to a creek bottom. There was an old country store at the crossroads that had closed in the early 90s, and that nobody had bought since. It was on my way home. I pulled back out onto the road. He did not say anything else. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes forward. I did not, at first, look at him. I looked at the road. The headlights pushed out into the pale blue-black of the pre-dawn, and the tobacco fields rolled past on either side, and the mist hung in the low places between them, and we drove. About a mile in, I glanced over at him. I want to tell you what I saw, because it was a small thing, and because it is the kind of thing that a person can talk himself out of in the moment, the way you can talk yourself out of any small thing that does not fit. The dashboard lights of the Ranger cast their soft greenish glow over the cab. They caught on the steering wheel in front of me. They caught on my own hands. They caught, in the rear-view mirror, on the lower half of my own face. They did not catch on him. He was sitting there beside me on the bench seat, in his dark work shirt and his dark pants and his small dark cap, and the dashboard lights were not lighting him the way they were lighting me. There was no greenish wash on his hands. There was no soft glow on the side of his face. He was sitting in a kind of dimness that the dashboard lights were not reaching, as if he were a little farther away than he actually was. I told myself it was the angle. I told myself it was the dark color of his clothes. I told myself it was the tiredness behind my own eyes. After a 10-hour shift at the mill, I kept driving. About a half mile from the crossroads at Mill Branch, We passed under the only streetlight on that stretch of road. It was a single sodium lamp on a tall wooden pole, set up by the county years ago at a small bend in the road where there had been a couple of bad accidents in the 70s. The light came down through the windshield and across the bench seat in a long, soft amber wash. I saw, in that wash, that the cab of my truck had only one shadow stretched across the bench seat. It was mine. It ran from my body toward the passenger side, the way my shadow always ran when I drove past that streetlight, leaning across the seat toward the door. The seat beside me was empty of any second shadow. The cap of the man, the shoulders of his shirt, his hands on his thighs, none of them threw any shadow at all. The amber light passed through the space he was sitting in as if there were nothing there to interrupt it. I did not look at him after that. I drove. My hands were on the wheel and my eyes were on the road, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat the way it had beaten when I had been a small child and had been lying in my bed in the dark, listening for footsteps in the hall. I did not look. I drove the last half-mile to Mill Branch with my eyes forward and my breath very shallow. He shifted beside me when the dark shape of the old country store came up on the right. I slowed. I came to a stop on the gravel apron in front of the store, the way I would have stopped to let any rider out. The headlights lit the front of the building, the boarded windows, the rusted soda machine that had been sitting there since I was a boy. I put the truck in park. He opened the door. He stepped down. He did not stumble. His boots made the small soft sound boots make on gravel. He stood for a moment beside the open door, and he turned his head, very slightly, in my direction. But he did not look at me. Not quite. He was looking, I think, at the dashboard, or at the empty seat where he had been, or at some small thing on the floor of the cab. He said, in the same low voice, much obliged. "Thank you, son." He closed the door. He walked off across the gravel apron, past the front of the old store, and out into the dark fields beyond it. There was no path that way. There were no houses. There was only a tobacco field that ran for almost a mile to the next rise. He walked into the dark with the same slow, stiff gait, and the headlights of my truck did not reach him for very long, and then he was gone. I sat in the truck at the crossroads for a long time. I do not know exactly how long. Long enough that the sky above the rise to the east had started to go gray. Long enough that a single bird had started to sing somewhere in the trees behind the store. When I finally put the truck in drive and pulled back out onto the road, my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the wheel hard with both of them to keep it steady. I drove the last 6 miles home very slowly. My mother called me at a little past 9 that morning. I had been asleep for maybe 4 hours. I picked up the phone in the kitchen of my small rental house, still half asleep, expecting nothing. She said my name, in the soft, careful voice she used when she had something to tell me, and she told me that Mr. Cleve Hatley, an old neighbor of ours from when I had been a boy, had passed away in his sleep that morning. She told me that his wife had found him a little before 4 o'clock, when she had woken up and reached over and felt the cold of him. She told me that the doctor had estimated the time of death at around 3:30 in the morning. She told me that Mr. Hatley had been a good man, that he had worked at the mill for almost 40 years, that he had retired the year before, and that he had always been kind to me when I was a child. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I did not say anything for a long time, and my mother asked me if I was all right, and I told her I was. I told her I was just tired from my shift. She told me one more thing before she hung up. She told me that the Hatleys lived on a small farm, about 6 miles from my house, on a road that ran down past Mill Branch, and that Mr. Hatley, her voice said softly, had been the kind of man who, all his life, had believed that when his time came he would walk himself the rest of the way home. I did not tell my mother about the man on the road. I have never told her. I have never told anybody, in fact. My father had warned me, when I was 16, never to pick up a man on the side of a country road in our county. I have wondered, many times since, whether the man I picked up that night was the kind of thing my father had been warning me about, or whether he was something else entirely. Some other small piece of country that had simply been making its way home and had been grateful for the ride. I do not know. I have never been able to decide. I only know that I do not take the long route home anymore, that I sold my father's pickup the next year, and that on summer mornings just before dawn, when the sky goes that pale blue-black and the mist hangs in the low places between the fields, I sometimes think about the small, soft sound of boots on gravel, and about a man in dark work clothes walking out across a tobacco field toward a place I cannot see. I was 34 years old in the fall of 2017, working as a traveling pharmaceutical rep for a mid-sized company out of Lexington, and I had been on the eastern Kentucky route for about 18 months by then. The job was the kind of job a young woman in my line of work took to build up her numbers before she could move into a bigger territory. The territory I had been given covered most of the eastern coalfield counties, and it took me through the kind of small mountain towns that most people who do not live in them have never heard of, places at the ends of two-lane state highways, places where the cell service drops off 20 miles before you arrive and does not come back until you leave. I drove a leased silver sedan with the company logo discreetly placed on the rear quarter panel, and I carried a wheeled sample case in the trunk, and I lived, for the 4 nights a week that I worked the route, in a series of clean-enough chain motels in the larger towns at the edges of my territory. I had grown up in the bluegrass, in a comfortable suburb outside Lexington, and the eastern coalfields had been, for the first 6 months of my route, a kind of revelation to me. I had not, before that job, understood how big my own state was, or how much of it had been emptied out by the long, slow death of the mines, or how the mountains there had a particular kind of silence to them, a heavy folded silence that pressed in on a small leased sedan with out-of-county plates, the way water presses on a diving bell. I had also not understood, before that job, how kind people in those towns could be, and how strange, and how suspicious of strangers, and how all 3 of those things could be true of the same person in the same 5-minute conversation. I had learned, by the fall of 2017, how to do my job there. I had learned the doctors. I had learned the office managers. I had learned which clinics served decent coffee in the waiting room, and which ones wanted you in and out in 15 minutes flat. I had learned the roads. The clinic I had visited that night was up a holler about 40 minutes from the motel where I was staying in a town called Hazard. I will not name the holler, partly because I do not wish to point anybody toward it, and partly because I have, over the years, become unsure that the holler is on any current map. The clinic was a small 2-room building set into the side of a hillside above a creek, run by an older nurse practitioner who took private appointments after hours for patients who could not get off work during the day. She was one of the providers on my route who liked to be visited late, after her last appointment, when she had time to sit and drink a cup of coffee and look through the samples I had brought her. I had stayed with her later than I had meant to, which was easy to do with her, and I had not pulled out of her gravel lot until almost 9:30. The drive back to Hazard was a road I had taken a dozen times. It ran out of the holler along the creek for about 3 miles, then climbed up over a low ridge through a section of hardwood forest, then dropped down into the next valley where the highway picked up and ran the rest of the way to my motel. The road was a winding 2-lane, narrow, with no shoulder to speak of, and the trees on either side of it grew right up to the asphalt in most places. There were no houses on the ridge. There were no businesses. There were a few old logging spurs that branched off into the woods and dead-ended after a quarter mile. I had driven that road in daylight and at dusk and in the rain. I had never driven it after full dark in November. It was full dark by the time I started up the ridge. The temperature outside was somewhere in the high 30s, cold enough that I had the heat on a low setting, and the air through the vents had the faint chemical smell that the air in a leased car has when the heat has not been used in a few months. The headlights pushed out into the dark, and the road unrolled in front of me at a steady 35 miles an hour. The speed I had learned was about right for that grade. The radio was on a public station out of Moorhead, very quiet, somebody talking softly about a new book. I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror, about 15 minutes into the drive. They were far back, the way headlights are far back when a car pulls onto the same road behind you a couple of curves behind. They were a normal pair of headlights. They were not high. They were not strangely bright. They were the headlights of a normal sedan, 400 feet or so behind me, holding a steady distance through the curves of the climb. I did not think anything of it at first. I had been on the ridge for 15 minutes without seeing another car, but it was not strange to see one. The clinic I had visited had patients who lived back in those hollers, and the nurse practitioner had told me she had 2 more appointments after me. It would have been the most natural thing in the world for one of those patients to be driving back over the ridge behind me. I sped up. I took the sedan up to 45, which was faster than I usually drove that grade. The headlights in my rear view kept the same distance. I slowed back down to 30. The headlights slowed. I held 30 for almost a mile, around 3 slow curves, and the headlights held their position behind me as if they were attached to my bumper by a wire of exactly 400 feet. They did not gain. They did not fall back. They followed at the exact speed I was driving, with the exact gap I had set when I had first noticed them. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things when you are alone in a car at night, that it was a coincidence. I told myself the driver behind me was probably tired, or careful, or driving the same speed I was for his own reasons. I told myself a lot of things in those first few minutes. None of them helped. I came over the top of the ridge and started down the other side. The headlights came over the ridge behind me. I took the first long curve down the descent, and the headlights took it. I took the second curve. The headlights took it. The road dropped down through the trees toward the highway. I want to tell you that I am not the kind of person who panics. I am not. I am the kind of person who, when something does not feel right, starts looking for explanations and starts running tests. I have always been like this. It is part of why I was good at my job. So when the road came to a small intersection at the bottom of the descent, where a side road I had never taken branched off to the right into the woods, I took the side road. I want you to understand what that meant. I did not need to take that side road. The highway to my motel was straight ahead, 4 miles. I took the side road only to see what the headlights would do. The headlights took the side road with me. I drove that road for about 3 miles. It was a narrower road than the one I had been on, more broken up, with patches where the asphalt had given way to packed gravel. I had no idea where it went. The headlights stayed at 400 feet. I came to another intersection, with a smaller road branching off to the left. I took the smaller road. The headlights took it. I drove for another 2 miles. I came to a fork. I took the right branch. The headlights took the right branch. I came to a place where the road forked again, and I took the left branch, and the headlights took the left branch. I had stopped knowing where I was. I had stopped knowing what county I was in. The roads were getting smaller, and the woods were getting closer, and my hands were getting tighter on the wheel. I drove like that for an hour and a half. I do not know, even now, exactly what roads I was on. I know the eastern coalfields a little, and I know that the backcountry there is a tangle of old county roads and logging spurs and roads that the state of Kentucky has not officially maintained since the 70s. And I know that you can drive for a long time on those roads without coming to anything that would tell you where you are. I drove on those roads for an hour and a half, picking turns at random, taking forks I could not have found again if you had paid me, climbing and descending small ridges I could not name, passing the same kind of trees and the same kind of dark in every direction. The headlights stayed at 400 feet behind me. They never gained. They never fell back. They never flashed. They never honked. They simply followed. At one point, on a long straight stretch through a section of hollow that I think was bottomland along some creek, I pulled the sedan over to the shoulder and stopped. I sat there with the engine running and watched the rear view. The headlights came up the road behind me at the same steady speed. They reached the point where, by my mental count, 400 feet behind me would have been. They stopped. They sat there in the dark, their high beams off, their low beams steady, 400 feet back, idling on the empty road with me. I could not see the car behind them. The headlights were too bright in the rear view to make out anything else. I watched them for almost 2 minutes. They did not move. I put the sedan back in drive. I pulled out onto the road. The headlights pulled out behind me at the same distance. After an hour and a half, I came around a long curve and saw, ahead of me, the orange glow of sodium lights and the green and white sign of a 24-hour gas station that I recognized from the south side of Hazard. I do not know how I had gotten back to it. I do not know what road I had come in on. I almost cried when I saw the sign. I pulled into the lot at speed, parked the sedan in the brightest spot I could find, right in front of the windows of the convenience store, and I got out, and I stood there in the fluorescent light with my keys in my hand and my breath visible in the cold, and I waited for the car behind me to pull in. It pulled in. It came down the road behind me at the same steady speed it had been driving for the last hour and a half. It turned into the lot. It drove the long way around to the far end, past the diesel pumps, and it parked in the last spot, the one furthest from the building, and the engine cut off. I could see. in the sodium light that it was a dark four-door sedan. I could see that the headlights had cut off when the engine had. I could not see, through the glare on the windshield, who was inside. The car simply sat there, dark and silent, parked at the far end of the lot. I stood beside my own car for what felt like a long time, and was probably 10 minutes. I waited for the door to open. I waited for somebody to step out. Nobody did. The car sat there. The lot was empty otherwise. The only sound was the hum of the lights overhead and the soft cycling of the cooler compressors inside the store. I went inside. The clerk was a heavy-set man in his 50s, watching a small television behind the counter. I bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers I did not want. I asked him, as casually as I could, if he had seen me pull in. He said he had. I asked him if he had noticed the dark sedan that had pulled in behind me. He looked over my shoulder, through the front windows, at the lot. He told me there was no dark sedan in the lot. There was only my car. I turned around. The lot, through the front windows, was empty except for my silver sedan, parked alone in front of the store. The far end of the lot, where the dark car had pulled in, was empty. There were no taillights on the road in either direction. I had not heard an engine start. I had not heard tires on the gravel. I would have heard either of those things from inside the store. The lot had been silent the whole time I had been in there. I asked the clerk, with my voice not entirely steady, whether he had seen any car pull in or out the entire time I had been inside. He looked at me for a long moment, the way a man looks at a customer who has come in saying something a little wrong. He told me he had not. He told me he had been watching the lot the whole time, the way he always watched the lot at night, because his manager wanted him to, and that nothing had pulled in or out since I had walked through the door. I drove the 4 miles to my motel, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I checked into my room. I locked the door. I did not sleep. I left the route the next morning and I drove back to Lexington, and I called my supervisor from a rest stop, and I told him I needed a different territory. He gave me one. I have not been back to the eastern coalfields since. I have a different job now, in a different state, and I do not, as a rule, drive at night anymore. I have thought about it many times. I have tried, the way you do, to think of explanations. I have considered tired drivers. I have considered locals testing the new face on the road. I have considered, in my worst moments, somebody who simply meant to follow me until I stopped somewhere isolated, and who lost his nerve when I made it to the lit lot. None of those explanations account for the car that pulled into the lot behind me, parked at the far end, cut its engine, and was no longer there 10 minutes later, on a lot the clerk had been watching the entire time. None of them account for an hour and a half of roads I was making up as I went. None of them account for the perfect, mechanical, 400-foot distance. What I have come to think, in the years since, is that there are roads in the eastern coalfields that are not for people from outside, and that I had been on those roads long enough by the fall of 2017 that something there had taken notice of me, and that whatever followed me that night was not following me because it wanted to catch me. I think it was following me because it wanted me to know I had been seen. I think it wanted me to understand that the next time I went up a holler after dark, I would not come back out the way I had come in. I did not give it a next time. I left. I have lived since, in the way you live after something like that, with the small, persistent sense that somewhere, on a road I cannot quite remember, 400 feet behind a car I no longer drive, a pair of low beams is still idling, patient and unhurried, waiting for me to come back. I was 38 years old in the spring of 2019, working as a project manager for a small construction firm in central North Carolina, and my younger sister Abigail had just gotten married in southwestern Virginia, in a small mountain town about 20 miles east of the Tennessee state line. The wedding had been on a Saturday afternoon at a small Presbyterian church my mother's family had attended for 4 generations, with a reception in the basement of the church afterward. The kind of reception with covered casseroles brought in by the older women of the congregation, and a sheet cake from a grocery store in the next town over, and a punch bowl with sherbet floating in it. My sister had married a good man, a high school chemistry teacher named Wesley, and the day had been the kind of long, warm family day that you carry around with you for a few weeks afterward, without quite letting it go. I had been the maid of honor. I had stayed at the reception until almost 10 at night, helping my mother and her sisters pack up the leftovers and fold up the chairs, and I had pulled out of the church parking lot a little before 10:30 in my pickup with a pan of leftover ham biscuits on the passenger seat and the smell of hairspray and church basement still on my dress. My drive home was about 4 hours. I had done it many times. The route ran east out of the mountains on a state highway, picked up an interstate for about an hour through the rolling country of Southside Virginia, dropped down into North Carolina on a smaller 4-lane, and finished on a state highway that wound the last 40 minutes back to my house in the country outside Greensboro. I had grown up driving that route, first as a passenger when I had been a child going to visit my grandparents, then as a teenager learning to drive my mother's car, then as a young woman in college making the trip home for holidays. I knew the gas stations. I knew the rest areas. I knew the long stretches where the radio went to static and the long stretches where it did not. I had driven that route, by my own count, somewhere between 40 and 50 times. It was a little after 11 o'clock at night when I crossed back into southwestern Virginia from the small mountain road that led out of my sister's town. The night was clear. There was a half moon up. The temperature was in the low 50s, cool enough that I had the heat on low, warm enough that I had cracked my window for the small, clean smell of spring woods through the vents. I was tired, but not exhausted. I had been pacing myself with a thermos of black coffee my aunt had pressed on me when I had left the church, and the coffee was good, and the radio was on a station out of Bristol that was playing old bluegrass, and the road was empty. The stretch of highway I want to tell you about is the section that cuts through a national forest in southwestern Virginia, about an hour and a half east of where I had left my sister's town. The highway there runs through deep hardwood forest for almost 20 miles, with no towns and no exits and very few side roads. It is one of the prettier stretches of the drive in daylight. At night, with the woods close on both sides and no other headlights for long minutes at a time, it is the kind of stretch that makes a long-haul driver glad of company on the radio. I had driven that section in every kind of weather and every hour, and I had always thought of it as one of the safer parts of the route. In the small, unexamined way you think things like that. I came around a long bend on a section of the highway I knew well, where the road curves gently to the left around the foot of a low ridge. The bend has a particular quality to it that I had always remembered, because the asphalt is older there than on the sections of road around it, and the lanes are slightly narrower, and the trees press in close to the shoulder. The woods on the right-hand side of the road drop down a steep slope into a creek hollow. The woods on the left climb up the ridge. My headlights came around the bend and caught on an orange detour sign. It was a standard road sign, the kind you see at construction sites and roadwork detours, an orange diamond with a black arrow on it. The arrow pointed to the right, off the highway, onto a narrow gravel road that branched off into the woods and started to climb. The sign was set on the right shoulder, on a metal stake driven into the gravel. There were two smaller signs below it. One, a black and white detour sign, with a left-pointing arrow corrected with a piece of tape to point right, and one a smaller orange sign that read simply, "Road closed ahead." I want to be clear about what I noticed in that moment, because it is the part of the story I have been over 1,000 times. There had been no warning signs leading up to the bend. There had been no flashing lights. There had been no orange traffic cones. There had been no advance notice of any construction work, and I had been driving with my eyes open and my mind half on the road, and there had been nothing, in the 20 minutes leading up to the bend, that suggested any work being done on the highway. The sign was simply there, set up on the shoulder of a bend in a national forest, pointing onto a gravel road I did not recognize. I had never seen the gravel road before. I had driven that bend in daylight perhaps 40 times. I had driven it at night perhaps 15 times. There had never, in any of those drives, been a road branching off to the right. I want to tell you that I thought about it carefully. I did not. I have been a project manager for a construction firm for 12 years. I had been raised by parents who valued careful behavior to follow road signs. I was tired. I was wearing a dress that was slightly too tight at the waist. I was in the middle of a state I had been driving across since I was 16. I saw a road sign that told me the road was closed ahead and that I should detour to the right, and I followed it. I slowed the pickup, I signaled, and I turned right onto the gravel road. The gravel road climbed. It started out the way a normal Forest Service road starts out, a graded gravel 2-lane wide enough for 2 cars to pass each other if both of them slowed down. The trees on either side were close. The headlights pushed out into the dark, and the gravel crunched under the tires, and the road climbed slowly up the side of the ridge to my right. I drove for about 5 minutes. I did not pass any other cars. I did not pass any other signs. There were no orange cones, no flagmen, no work lights, no flashing yellow beacons, no parked equipment. There was no indication, anywhere on the road, that any work was being done or had ever been done. After about 10 minutes, I started to think that the detour was longer than I would have expected. After 15 minutes, the gravel road began to narrow. The 2-lane became more like a lane and a half, and the gravel under the tires got rougher, and the trees on either side started to lean in over the road, the way trees lean over old logging spurs that the Forest Service has not maintained in years. After 20 minutes, the road had narrowed to a single lane, and the gravel had turned to packed dirt, and the trees were close enough on both sides that small branches were brushing against the side mirrors of my pickup as I drove. That was when I started to feel it. It was the cold sweat at the back of my neck that tells you something is wrong. I want to describe it carefully, because it is a particular feeling, and it is one I have come to trust in the years since. It is not panic. It is not fear, exactly. It is the small alarm at the base of your skull that goes off when the part of your brain that watches your environment notices something the rest of you has not yet caught up to. I have felt that alarm 3 times in my life. Once when I was 17 and a man at a state fair followed me from one booth to another for about 10 minutes. Once at a project site when I walked under a piece of scaffolding I had not been supposed to walk under, and a beam fell behind me about 30 seconds later. And once in the spring of 2019, on a packed dirt road in a national forest in southwestern Virginia, at about 11:30 at night, with a pan of leftover ham biscuits on the passenger seat of my pickup. I stopped. I want to tell you that I made the decision to stop calmly. I did not. I stopped because my body stopped, because my foot came off the gas and onto the brake before I had decided to do it, and because my hands were already gripping the wheel hard enough that my knuckles were white. I sat in the cab with the engine idling and the headlights pushing out into a road that was no longer a road I was willing to drive on. The road in front of me, in the headlights, kept going. It climbed gently. It curved away to the left around something I could not quite see in the trees. There were no lights ahead. There was no sound except the soft tick of the engine and the small movement of branches against the mirror. The woods on either side were absolutely still. The half moon was somewhere behind the ridge to my right, and the only light on the road was the light I had brought with me. I could not turn around easily. The road was too narrow. I had to do a 3-point turn, with the front bumper pushed up against the leaves on the left side and the rear bumper pushed up against the leaves on the right side, and I had to do it carefully because there was a drop-off behind the right shoulder that I had not noticed on the way up. It took me almost 2 minutes to get the truck pointed back the way I had come. I drove back down the way I had come at 20 miles an hour, with both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road and my breath very shallow. The drive down took 20 minutes, the same as the drive up. I came down through the section where the road widened back to a lane and a half, and then to a 2-lane, and then I saw the gravel get smoother, and then I saw, ahead of me, the soft glow of the highway through the trees, and I came down the last 100 yards of the gravel road and out onto the pavement. The orange detour sign was gone. There was no metal stake on the right shoulder. There were no smaller signs below it. There was no detour sign with a piece of tape on it. There was no road closed ahead. The shoulder of the highway, where the sign had been set up, was empty, packed gravel. There were no holes in the gravel that would have indicated a stake had been driven and removed. There were no tire tracks from a maintenance truck. There was no orange paint on the pavement, no chalk lines, no flags. There was nothing on the highway, in either direction, to suggest that anybody had been working on the road that night, or that anybody had ever set up any sign at all. I sat in my pickup at the foot of the gravel road for a long time. I do not know how long. The highway in both directions was empty. The bend was the bend I had driven 100 times in my life. The asphalt was the slightly older asphalt I remembered. The trees were the same trees. The only difference between the bend I had come around 40 minutes earlier and the bend I was sitting on was that the orange detour sign was no longer there, and that I no longer had any idea where I had been for the last 40 minutes. I drove the rest of the way home very slowly. I did not stop again. I got into my house at almost 3:30 in the morning. I took off the dress and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I cried for a long time without quite knowing what I was crying about. The next morning, I called the Virginia Department of Transportation. I told the woman on the phone what road I had been on and roughly what time I had been there, and I asked her if there had been any active construction work or any detours set up on that section of highway on the night of my drive. She put me on hold for a long time. When she came back, she told me that there had been no scheduled work on that stretch of highway for at least the past 6 months, and that there were no records of any emergency work or accident response that had required a detour on the night I was asking about. She asked me, with a small amount of professional concern, if I had been involved in an accident. I told her I had not. I thanked her. I hung up. I drive that route twice a year now, for Thanksgiving and for the small annual gathering that my mother and her sisters have at my sister's house at the start of summer. I drive it during the day when I can. I always slow down at the bend. I always look at the right shoulder, at the patch of gravel where the sign had been. I have looked, on every drive home since, for the gravel road that branched off to the right. I have never been able to find it. There is no break in the trees on the right shoulder of that bend. There is no sign of an old logging spur. The woods on the right-hand side of the road drop down a steep slope into the creek hollow, and they have always dropped down that slope, and there is no road there. There is not now, and I am told by my uncle, who has hunted those woods for 50 years, there has never been one. I do not know what road I drove on for 40 minutes that night. I do not know what was at the end of it, around the curve in the dark, that the road had been climbing toward. I do not know what would have happened if I had not stopped. I have come to believe, in the small, careful way a project manager comes to believe things, that the part of my brain that put the cold sweat on the back of my neck saved my life that night, and that whatever I had been driving toward was patient enough, in 2019, to put up a detour sign on a state highway in a national forest at 11:30 at night, and trust that a tired woman in a pickup with a pan of ham biscuits on the passenger seat would simply follow the arrow. I do not know whether the sign is still there for other people. I have come to think it is. I think about sometimes what kind of woman the sign is set out for, and on what nights, and what the difference is between the women who turn around on the packed dirt and the women who keep driving around the curve in the dark. I think about how I have not seen, in any newspaper, the disappearance of anybody who would have been driving that highway alone at that hour in 2019. I think about how, of course, that is not the kind of thing you would necessarily see in a newspaper. I think about my sister, who lives 20 miles from that bend, and who has driven through it many times, and to whom I have never told this story. I do not think I will tell her. I think she has the right to drive that road, twice a year, on her way to see our mother, without a sign in her head that she should be looking for. I was 31 years old in the winter of 2012, working as a sheriff's deputy in a rural county in the eastern foothills of North Carolina, and I had been on the overnight shift for almost 2 years by then. The county I worked was the kind of county that does not show up in many stories about North Carolina. A long stretch of farmland and pine forest between two larger counties, with one small town at the center of it, where the courthouse and the jail and the high school and the only stoplight all sat within 3 blocks of each other. The county had a population of about 18,000 people. The sheriff's office had 22 sworn deputies. We worked overlapping shifts in 3 patrol zones, and on most nights, between midnight and 6 in the morning, the entire county was covered by 3 of us, in 3 cruisers. I had grown up about an hour south of where I worked, in a similar kind of county, and I had been raised by a father who had been a state highway patrol officer for 28 years. I had wanted to be a deputy since I was about 10 years old. By the winter of 2012, I had been wearing the uniform for almost 5 years, and I had settled into the work the way a man settles into work that he was made for, with the small, steady satisfaction of doing a job that mattered to people he had grown up around. The road I want to tell you about ran along the eastern edge of our county, parallel to a small river that formed the county line. It was a county road, 2-lane, blacktop in fair condition, with a posted speed limit of 45 and almost no traffic between the hours of 10 at night and 5 in the morning. The road ran for about 14 miles between 2 small communities at either end of the county. For most of those 14 miles, it passed through tobacco fields and stretches of planted pine forest, with the occasional small farmhouse set well back from the shoulder. There were a few tobacco barns along the road, the old kind with the gray weathered wood and the rusted tin roofs, most of them no longer in active use, but still standing in the corners of fields where their owners had not gotten around to tearing them down. There was a long stretch in the middle of the road, about 4 miles long, where there were no houses at all, only the fields on one side and the pine forest on the other, and where the road climbed up over a low rise and came down through a long, shallow curve before crossing a small creek on a concrete bridge. That stretch was the stretch where it happened. It was a Tuesday in the second week of February. The temperature outside was somewhere in the high 20s, cold enough that there was a thin frost on the grass along the shoulder when my headlights caught it, but not cold enough that the road itself was icy. The night was clear. There was a bright half moon up. I had taken a coffee from the gas station at the south end of the county at a little before midnight, and I had been working my way up the eastern road for the past 2 hours, the way I usually did on quiet nights, driving slowly, watching for anything that needed watching. There had been one call earlier in the shift, a domestic disturbance at a trailer park outside the small town, which had been handled by another deputy. There had been nothing else. I came up over the rise on the long, empty stretch a little before 2 in the morning. The headlights pushed out into the long, shallow curve down the other side, and the pine forest stood close on the right-hand side of the road, and the tobacco field on the left was a long, flat darkness, with the silhouette of an old barn in the middle distance. I was driving at about 35, slower than the speed limit, the way you drive when you are alone on a long stretch of road, and there is nothing in particular to hurry toward. I came around the curve. My headlights caught a family crossing the road in single file in front of me. I want to tell you exactly what I saw, because I have gone over it many times in the last 13 years, and the picture has not faded. There were 4 of them. There was a man in front, walking slowly. He was wearing a heavy flannel coat, the kind of coat a working man would wear in the winter, dark plaid with the collar turned up. He had on dark trousers. He was hatless. His hair was dark and short. He was looking straight ahead, in the direction he was walking, which was from the right-hand side of the road to the left, from the pine forest toward the tobacco field. Behind him, about 3 feet back, there was a woman. She was wearing a long dress. The dress was a pale color, possibly gray or possibly faded blue, and it came down past her ankles. She had a heavy shawl around her shoulders. Her hair was dark and long and pinned up in some kind of arrangement at the back of her head. She was holding the hand of a small child, a girl, who was walking on her left side. The girl was maybe 4 years old. The girl was wearing a long pale dress similar to the woman's. Her hair was in 2 braids. Behind the woman and the girl, walking on his own about 2 feet back, there was a small boy. He was maybe 6. He was wearing dark short pants and a dark coat and a small cap. His hands were at his sides. They were all walking slowly. They were all looking straight ahead, in the direction they were walking, which was toward the tobacco field on the left side of the road. None of them turned their heads when my headlights hit them. None of them stopped. None of them changed their pace. They walked across the road in single file, in the slow, steady way of a family walking somewhere they meant to go, as if my cruiser was not there at all. I braked hard. I want to be honest about how hard I braked. I had been trained, in the academy, to brake firmly, but in control, when something appeared in the road in front of me. I did not do that. I stomped on the brakes the way a civilian stomps on the brakes when a deer steps into the road, and the cruiser shuddered and skidded slightly and came to a stop with the front bumper, maybe 20 feet from where the family had been, when I had first seen them. By the time I had stopped, they had already crossed the center line. The man was on the left shoulder. The woman and the girl were a step behind him. The boy was a step behind them. They were all still walking. They walked off the shoulder into the edge of the tobacco field, in single file, and they kept walking, in the same slow, steady pace, into the field and away from the road. The headlights of my cruiser caught them in profile as they walked, the man, then the woman and the girl, then the boy. They walked about 10 feet into the field. The headlights began to lose them in the dark and the small ground mist that hung over the furrows. I saw the dark shapes of their backs receding. I saw the pale color of the woman's dress and the small white shape of the girl's braids against it. I saw the small dark shape of the boy. Then I did not see them anymore. I sat in my cruiser for a long time. I do not know how long. The radio on my shoulder hissed faintly with the small static of the county frequency. I had not called anything in. I had not radioed dispatch. I realized after some long stretch of seconds, even put the cruiser in park. I put the cruiser in park. I turned on my hazard lights. I turned on the spotlight, mounted on the driver's side door pillar, and I swept it slowly across the tobacco field on the left side of the road. The spotlight caught on the rows of cut tobacco stubble, and on the small puffs of frost on the upturned earth, and on the silhouette of the old barn in the middle distance. It did not catch on any people. I got out of the cruiser. I had my flashlight in one hand, and my other hand was on the grip of my service weapon, not because I had decided to put it there, but because in 5 years of training, that was where my hand went when I got out of a cruiser into something I did not understand. The cold air bit through my jacket. I walked, slowly, around the front of the cruiser, into the spill of my own headlights, and I crossed the road to the left shoulder, where the family had stepped off into the field. The shoulder there was soft dirt, the kind of soft dirt that holds a footprint cleanly in the cold of a February night. There was a thin layer of frost on it. I shined my flashlight down at the dirt. There were no footprints. There were no scuffs in the frost. There were no broken weeds along the edge where the shoulder met the field. The shoulder was smooth, with a fine, even layer of frost, the way a shoulder looks when nobody has set foot on it for hours. I stood there for a long time with the flashlight pointed down at the smooth frost. I want to tell you that I went looking for them. I did. I walked out into the field, slowly, in the line they had been walking. I shined the flashlight ahead of me into the rows of cut tobacco. I called out, the way a deputy calls out, identifying myself and saying that I was there to help. The field was silent. There was no movement. There was no answer. The old barn in the middle distance was a dark shape against the dark sky. I walked out about 30 feet, and then I stopped. The cold sweat was on the back of my neck. The dirt of the field, in the beam of my flashlight, was undisturbed. There were no footprints anywhere. There was no path of broken stubble where 4 people had walked through it. I walked back to the road. I crossed back to my cruiser. I got in. I sat with the door closed and the engine running, and I tried to slow my breathing down. I did not call dispatch. I did not, in the end, write up a report. I drove the rest of the road slowly, with my eyes on the shoulders, and I finished my shift, and I went home at 6 in the morning, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee I did not drink. I worked the overnight shift in that county for another 4 years. I drove that road probably 400 more times. I never saw the family again. It was about 2 years later, in the spring of 2014, that I learned I was not the first. I had been having a beer after a shift with a senior deputy named Carl Henson, a man who had been on the force for almost 30 years and who was within a year or so of his retirement. We had been talking about nothing in particular. The conversation had drifted into the kinds of stories that a man with 30 years on a rural force has to tell, the small, strange things he has seen on long, quiet nights. I do not remember exactly how the subject came up. I think he mentioned the Eastern Road. I think he mentioned the long stretch by the creek. I think I went very quiet, the way you go quiet when somebody mentions something you have been carrying. Carl told me, in his careful, slow way, that he had seen a family cross that road in single file at around 2 in the morning, in the spring of 1991, on a Tuesday in March. He described them in a way that I did not need to interrupt. The man in the flannel coat, walking in front. The woman in the long pale dress with the shawl, holding the hand of the small girl. The boy in the dark coat and the cap, walking behind. He told me that he had braked hard and that they had not turned their heads. He told me that they had walked into the tobacco field and disappeared, and that he had walked the field afterward with his flashlight and had not found any footprints. He told me that he had not written up a report. He told me that he had asked, very carefully, over the years that followed, of the older deputies who had been with the county before him, and he had learned that 2 other deputies had seen the same family at the same hour at different points in their careers. One in 1973 and one in 1986, both times in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, both times crossing from the pine forest on the right-hand side of the road to the tobacco field on the left, both times walking in the same single file, in the same slow, steady pace, looking straight ahead, ignoring the cruiser. both times disappearing into the field without a footprint behind them. Carl told me, that night over the beer, that the road had been there since the 1870s. The fields on either side had been worked by the same family for almost 100 years before the man who currently owned them had bought them. The pine forest on the right had been planted in the 1950s on what had previously been more open farmland. There had been, somewhere on that stretch of road, in the late 1890s, a small farmhouse that had burned to the ground in a fire that had killed an entire family. The newspaper records of the time were thin. Carl had looked into them once. The farmhouse had stood about half a mile back from where the road now ran. The family had been a man, his wife, and their 2 children, a girl and a boy. The boy had been about 6. The girl had been about 4. They had been buried in a small private plot somewhere on the original farm, which Carl had never been able to find. I have been retired from the sheriff's office for 2 years now. I am 44 years old. I have a wife and 2 children of my own. I do not, anymore, work the overnight shift on any road. I have driven the Eastern Road a few times in daylight in the past 2 years, on the way to visit a friend who lives in the town at the north end of it. I have never driven it at night again. I think about the family sometimes. I think about the way the girl was holding the woman's hand. I think about the small, careful way the boy was walking behind them, on his own, the way a small boy walks when he is being trusted to keep up with the adults. I think about how, in the brief moment my headlights had been on them, none of them had looked tired or hurt or frightened. They had been walking somewhere they meant to go. They had been a family on a walk in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, the way a family might walk to church or to a neighbor's house or down to a creek bottom, in the kind of county we lived in some long ago version of a winter night when the road they were crossing had not yet been a road. I have come to think, in the years since, that they were not crossing the road. I think the road was crossing them. I think they had been walking, somewhere, on a path that had been there for a long time before any blacktop had been laid down through the middle of it, and that they were still walking it, the way some things keep walking long after the houses they walk toward are gone, and that on certain Tuesday mornings in the small hours, when the conditions are right and the moon is in the right place, the line they walk crosses the line we drive, and we see them for the 4 or 5 seconds it takes them to pass through. I think we see them. I think they do not see us. I think that is the kindest way to think about it. I have not, in the years since, found a kinder way. I had been driving a delivery route for a regional auto parts company out of Knoxville for almost 6 years when it happened, in the summer of 2015. I was 43 years old. I had a wife I had been married to for 16 years, a woman named Rhonda, who worked as a billing clerk at a hospital, and a daughter named Caitlin, who was 12 and had just finished 6th grade. We lived in a small ranch house outside Maryville, in the kind of subdivision that sits on what used to be a tobacco farm, with a long shared driveway and a row of identical mailboxes at the road. I had grown up in eastern Kentucky, in a coal town that had been emptying out since the 1970s, and I had moved to Tennessee for the auto parts job in my late 30s, after the warehouse I had worked at for 14 years had closed. The job in Knoxville was a good job. The pay was steady. The benefits were decent. The route I drove was the Eastern Tennessee mountain route, which meant I delivered parts to a circuit of small independent garages and tractor mechanics in the high country between Knoxville and the North Carolina line, and I drove most of it in the early morning hours, so that the parts would be at the shops when they opened at 7. I had a CB radio bolted to my dashboard. Most of the drivers in our company still ran them in 2015. Cell service in those mountains was unreliable, the kind of unreliable where you could go 40 minutes between bars even on the main highway, and the CB was a useful piece of backup for emergencies and for the occasional bit of road information from the long-haul truckers who used the same passes. I kept mine on Channel 19, the trucker channel, the way most of us did. The chatter was usually thin in the small hours, a few familiar voices, the occasional warning about a bear in the road or a downed tree on a switchback, mostly silence and the soft hiss of an open channel. I had grown comfortable with the small companionship of that hiss in the way you grow comfortable with the sound of a clock in a room you sleep in. The night I want to tell you about was a Wednesday in late July. The temperature in the mountains had been in the high 70s during the day, and it had dropped down into the low 60s by midnight, the way it does up there even in summer. I had picked up my route load at the warehouse in Knoxville at a little before 11, and I had started up into the mountains around 11:30. My first stop was a small garage in a town outside Newport, with parts due there for a 7 o'clock opening, and I had built my route to give me time for a couple of stops at all-night gas stations along the way for coffee and a sandwich. I was driving the company's mid-size box truck, a white Isuzu with our logo on the side, with about 300 pounds of carburetors and brake pads and timing belts in the back. I had the windows down a couple of inches for the cool air. The radio in the dashboard, the regular one, was on a Knoxville classic country station, the volume low. I had been on the route maybe 90 minutes when I came onto the long mountain road. It is a state highway that runs along a ridge for almost 20 miles before dropping down into a valley with my second stop in it. I had driven that road 100 times, in every kind of weather. The road climbs slowly along the spine of a long ridge, with the land falling away on both sides into deep wooded hollows. And there are stretches where the trees grow close to the shoulder, and stretches where you can see for miles across the valley to the south on a clear night. There are no towns on the ridge. There are no houses. There are no businesses. There are a few pull-offs for hunters, and a single picnic area maintained by the state, and that is all. The road is the kind of road that long-haul truckers avoid because of the grades, which meant that I usually had it to myself in the small hours. Around 1 in the morning, I was about 8 miles into the ridge stretch. I had crossed a small bridge over a creek that ran through a notch in the ridge, and I had started up a long, gentle climb that led to a high point about 3 miles ahead. The radio was on low. The headlights pushed out into the dark, and the ridge fell away on the right-hand side into a black wooded hollow that I knew, from daylight drives, dropped almost 600 feet down to a small, unnamed creek. There were no other cars on the road. There were no other lights anywhere on the ridge. The CB radio came on by itself. I want to tell you what that looked like, because it is the kind of detail you remember. The CB had been silent for the last half hour. The channel light, which was a small green LED on the front face of the unit, was off. The volume knob was set where I always set it, at about a third. The squelch was set just past the point where the static cut out, the way I had learned to set it years before. The CB had been sitting on the dashboard like any other piece of equipment, doing nothing, the way it had been doing nothing for the last 40 minutes. And then the channel light came on. It went from off to on, without any flicker. It glowed a steady, soft green. The unit emitted the small, particular hiss it emits when somebody on the other end has keyed up a microphone and is about to speak. A voice came through. I want to describe the voice carefully. It was a man's voice. It was quiet. It was calm. It was not the kind of voice you hear on a CB radio, which is usually compressed and tinny and pitched up by the small speaker in the unit. This voice was clear. It was warm. It was, in some way I have not been able to put words to in the 10 years since, very close. It sounded like a man speaking from the passenger seat of my truck, leaning slightly toward me, with his mouth maybe 2 feet from my ear. It did not sound like a transmission. It sounded like a person. The voice said my full name. It said it the way somebody who knew me would say it. First name, middle name, last name. The middle name was the name of my grandfather, who had died when I was 19. It was a name I rarely used and that almost nobody outside my immediate family knew. The voice said it in a tone that was friendly and unhurried, the way somebody on the phone says your full name when they are confirming who they are talking to. It said my wife's full name, first name, maiden name, married name. The maiden name was a name Rhonda had not used in 16 years. The voice said it the same way, calmly, friendly, confirming. It said my daughter's full name, first name, middle name, last name. Caitlin's middle name was the name of Rhonda's mother, who had died of cancer when Caitlin was 5. It is a name we use only in formal contexts. It is on her birth certificate and her social security card, and almost nowhere else. Then the voice said the address of the house I had grown up in. I want you to understand what that was. The house I had grown up in was a small 2-bedroom company house in a coal town in eastern Kentucky. The address was a route number and a box number, the kind of mail address that does not exist anymore in most places, the kind that the post office stopped using sometime in the 90s. The house had been torn down in 1998, when the company that had owned the patch sold the land for timber rights, and the bulldozers had come in and taken down everything that had been left standing. I had not lived at that address in 22 years. The address itself, the route and box number, was not a current postal address anywhere in the United States. It was an address that existed only in the memory of people who had received mail there before 1996. There were not very many of us left. The voice said the address. It said it the way you would read it off an envelope, calmly and clearly, with the small pause between the route number and the box number that you would put there if you were saying it out loud. Then the voice said, in the same calm tone, "Please pull over." I did not pull over. I want to tell you that I made the decision to keep driving. I did not make a decision. My foot stayed on the gas, my hand stayed on the wheel, my eyes stayed on the road. I think the part of me that had been listening to the voice had not yet caught up to the part of me that was driving the truck, and the part of me that was driving the truck simply kept driving. I have thought about that many times in the years since. I have thought about how, if I had been a slightly different kind of man, the kind of man who responds quickly to a calm voice, giving him a calm instruction, I might have pulled over. I think about what would have happened then. I do not know. The voice did not repeat itself. The CB hissed for another second or two. The channel light went off. The unit went silent. The road in my headlights kept unrolling, narrow and dark, with the trees close on both sides. I drove the rest of the ridge with my hands tight on the wheel. The CB stayed off. The regular radio stayed on the country station, somebody singing about a small town in Georgia. I did not turn it off. I did not turn it up. I did not look over at the CB. I kept my eyes on the road. The ridge stretched out ahead of me for another 9 miles before it started its descent into the valley, and I drove those 9 miles at a steady 45 miles an hour, and I did not stop, and I did not slow down, and I did not look at the shoulders. I came down off the ridge at a little before 2 in the morning. I made my stop at the garage outside Newport. I made my stop at the second garage, in a small town further east. I made the rest of my route. I delivered every part on my manifest. I drove home. I pulled into my driveway in the subdivision outside Maryville at a little before 7 in the morning, the way I usually did. The sky was getting light. Rhonda was already in the kitchen making coffee. Caitlin was still asleep. I did not go inside right away. I sat in the cab of the truck in my driveway for a long time. Then I got out, and I opened the toolbox in the back, and I got the small set of screwdrivers I keep there, and I went around to the cab, and I unscrewed the CB radio from the dashboard. I unbolted the bracket. I pulled the antenna lead out from where it ran up through the headliner. I coiled the cord around the unit. I put the whole thing in a small cardboard box that had a coffee maker in it once, and I taped the box shut. I put the box in my garage, on the shelf above where I keep the lawn fertilizer. I went inside. Rhonda was at the kitchen table reading a news website on her tablet. She looked up at me and smiled and asked me how the route had been. I told her it had been quiet. She told me she had made fresh coffee. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table and I drank a cup of coffee, and I did not say anything about the CB radio, and I did not say anything about the voice. The box has been on the shelf in my garage for 10 years. I have not plugged the CB back in. I have not turned it on. I quit the auto parts job in the spring of 2017, and I took a different job with a different company that has me driving a forklift in a warehouse in Knoxville and home every night by 6. I do not drive the mountains anymore. I do not drive at night anymore. I have never told Rhonda about the voice. I have not told Caitlin, who is 22 now and finishing college at the University of Tennessee. I have not told my brother, who is the only other person alive, who would still recognize the route and box number, the voice said. I have thought about it almost every day for 10 years. I have tried to come up with explanations. I have considered cross-band interference, signal bleed, malicious truckers with a scanner, and a personal grudge, somebody at the company who had access to my employee file. None of those explanations account for my grandfather's middle name, which is not on any document my employer holds. None of them account for Rhonda's maiden name, which Rhonda has not used since before I met her. None of them account for the route and box number of a house that has not existed since 1998. None of them account for the closeness of the voice, which I can tell you, even now, was not the closeness of a CB transmission. What I have come to think, in the long quiet years since, is that the voice on the CB that night was not asking me to pull over because it wanted me to do something. I think it was asking me to pull over because the asking was the thing it wanted to do. I think there is something on that ridge in eastern Tennessee that listens for men driving alone in the small hours and that learns enough about them, somehow, to call them by their full names and the names of their wives and their daughters and the addresses of houses they have not lived in for a very long time. And that picks one of them on one quiet Wednesday night in late July and asks him, calmly, in a voice like a friend leaning in from the passenger seat, to pull over. I do not know what the asking is for. I do not know whether the men who pull over are taken somewhere or simply stopped on the shoulder for a long time, or whether they come back later down the ridge with the same eyes they went up with. I have not, in 10 years, met another driver who has heard the voice. I have also not, in 10 years, asked. I think there is a kind of question you can ask in the small hours after a long shift that, once you have asked it, you cannot unask. And I have not wanted to be the man who asks it. I have wanted to be the man who unscrewed the CB and put it in the box and never plugged it back in. I have been that man for 10 years. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and Rhonda is asleep beside me and Caitlin is in her dorm in Knoxville, I lie in bed and I think about the small green channel light coming on in the dark of my old delivery truck, and I think about the calm, friendly voice saying my full name, and I think about how it must still be there, on the ridge, in the dark, hissing softly to itself in the small hours. And I think about how grateful I am that I kept driving, and how, every single time I think about it, I am a little less sure that the gratitude is the right feeling, and a little less sure of what would have been on the other side of pulling over, and a little less sure that the voice, in some quiet, patient way I do not understand, is finished with me yet. I had been an emergency medical technician with a small private ambulance service in eastern Kentucky for almost 4 years in the spring of 2016, and I had been working the overnight shift for almost 2 of those years. The service I worked for was the kind of small operation that handled mostly the work the county ambulances did not have the staff for, which meant a lot of long inter-facility transfers between the small regional hospital in our county and the larger trauma centers in Lexington and Knoxville. We ran 2 trucks. The crews worked in pairs, 1 driver and 1 tech in the back, with the patient. On the long transfers, after we had handed the patient off at the receiving hospital, the 2 of us would switch off driving on the way home, and the one not driving would usually try to sleep in the passenger seat or in the jump seat in the back, because the runs sometimes took 8 or 9 hours round trip, and sleep, when you could get it, was precious. I was 28 years old in the spring of 2016. My partner that night was a man named Perry Loudermilk, who was about 40, who had been an EMT for almost 15 years, and who had a wife and 3 kids in a small house outside the same town I lived in. We had been working together for about 6 months by that point. We got along the way. You get along with somebody you have spent 1,000 hours in a small, enclosed cab with, which is to say comfortably, with long stretches of silence and the occasional joke and a kind of unspoken trust. He was a steady man. He did not get rattled. He had been a paramedic in the Army before he had come back home to Kentucky. The transfer that night was a routine one. We had taken an older woman from our county hospital to a cardiac unit in Lexington, the kind of run we did 3 or 4 times a week. We had handed her off at the receiving hospital at a little before midnight. We had eaten a late dinner at a 24-hour diner near the highway, and we had started home a little before 1 in the morning. Perry had driven the first leg, the hour and a half down the parkway, while I had tried to sleep in the passenger seat. We had switched at a gas station outside Hazard. I was driving the second leg, the back roads through the eastern coalfields, while he slept. He was good at sleeping in a moving ambulance. He had the seat reclined a few inches and his head tilted to the left against the window. He was breathing slow and even. The road I want to tell you about is a state road that cuts through a section of bottomland along a small river in our county. I will not name the river or the road, partly because I do not need to point anybody to it, and partly because I have, in the years since, found that I do not like saying the names out loud. The road is a long, straight stretch, almost 6 miles of it, through flat farmland that sits in a wide bend of the river. The land on either side has been farmed for over 100 years. It is some of the only flat ground in our county, and most of it is planted in field corn or soybeans, depending on the rotation. In the spring of 2016, the corn was already up. It had been a warm spring. The corn was about chest high, dense and green, planted in long rows that ran perpendicular to the road. There are no houses on that stretch of road. There used to be a couple of farmsteads in the bottomland, but they had been bought out by a corporate operation in the 90s and torn down, and the only buildings left were a few tin equipment sheds, set back about a quarter-mile from the road. The nearest occupied house was almost 12 miles from the middle of that stretch. It was a little before 3 in the morning when I came onto the road. The temperature outside was in the low 50s. The sky was clear, and there was a thin moon. I had the cab quiet, with the radio off and the heater on low, because Perry was asleep beside me. The headlights pushed out into the dark and the road unrolled in front of me, perfectly straight, with the dark green wall of the corn rising on both sides of the shoulder. The white center line of the road glowed in the headlights. I had the cruise set at 50. The ambulance was empty in the back, the gurney strapped down, the cabinets latched, the way we left it after a transfer. I had been driving for about 10 minutes. I was about a mile from the small town I lived in. I had been thinking idly about what I was going to make for breakfast when I got home, and whether I was going to bother with breakfast or just go straight to bed. My headlights caught the boy in the middle of the road. He was standing on the yellow line. He was small. He was about 7 years old, maybe 8, the way you can tell a child's age in a quick glance, even if you are not used to children. He was wearing pajamas. They were a light color, possibly pale blue, with some kind of pattern on them that I could not make out at the distance. His feet were bare. His hair was light brown and short. He was standing perfectly still, with his arms at his sides, facing me directly, his small face lit up in the spill of my high beams. He was looking right at me. I braked. I did not slam on the brakes the way you do when an animal runs out into the road. I braked firmly, the way you brake when you see a person standing in your lane and you have time to slow down without panicking. And I had time, because the road was straight, and I had seen him from far enough back. The cruise control kicked off. The ambulance slowed smoothly. I felt Perry shift in the passenger seat as the deceleration pulled at him, and his hand came up to the door handle, the way a person's hand does when they are coming out of sleep into something they do not yet understand. He said, in a thick voice, "What?" I said, "There is a kid in the road." I brought the ambulance to a complete stop about 30 feet from the boy. The headlights were still on him. He had not moved. He was still standing on the yellow line. His hands were still at his sides. He was still looking right at me, with his small face turned up slightly to track the cab of the ambulance as I had slowed down. The expression on his face was not frightened. It was not curious. It was not anything in particular. It was the kind of blank, watchful expression a child has when he is waiting for an adult to do something. Perry sat up in the passenger seat and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked through the windshield at the boy. He said, very quietly, "What the hell?" I said, "I do not know." I put the ambulance in park. I left the headlights on. I left the engine running. I unbuckled my seatbelt, and I opened the driver's door, and I stepped out onto the road. The night air outside the cab was cold and clean. It smelled of damp earth and growing corn and the faint mineral smell of the river somewhere off to the north. The road was silent. There were no cars in either direction. The corn on both sides of me was a tall, dark wall. The only sounds were the low diesel idle of the ambulance, and the small ticking of the engine, and the faint rustle of corn leaves in a breeze I could just barely feel on my face. The boy did not move. He stood on the yellow line, 30 feet ahead of me, looking at me. I started walking toward him. I had my hands out at my sides, palms forward, the way I had been trained to approach a frightened child or a confused patient, and I was talking as I walked, the soft, easy talk you use in those situations. I told him my name. I told him I was an EMT. I told him I was here to help, and I asked him if he was lost, and I asked him if he could tell me his name, and I asked him if his mommy or his daddy was nearby. I kept my voice low and warm. I walked slowly. I did not want to spook him. The road was empty in both directions, and there was no traffic, and I had time to do this carefully. He did not answer me. He did not move. He stood on the yellow line and watched me come. When I was about 10 feet from him, he turned. He turned in a single, smooth motion, without changing his posture or hesitating, the way a small child turns when his mother calls him from another room. He turned to face the right side of the road. He took one step off the yellow line. He took another step. He walked across the right-hand lane in 3 small barefoot steps, and he stepped off the asphalt onto the soft dirt of the shoulder, and he walked off the shoulder into the corn. The corn closed behind him. I want to tell you what that looked like. The corn was about chest high on me, which meant it was over the boy's head. He walked into the rows the way a small child walks through tall grass, his arms slightly out, his small body brushing the leaves on either side. He took 5 or 6 steps into the corn. The leaves moved around him as he went. Then the leaves stopped moving, and the boy was gone. I stood at the edge of the shoulder with my flashlight up. I had drawn it without thinking. The beam swept across the rows of corn where he had gone in. The corn was still. There was no movement. There was no sound. The leaves on the stalks where he had passed were not even visibly disturbed. I shouted his way. I called out, "Hey buddy, hey son, are you all right? Can you come back to the road, the way you call out to a child?" And my voice was loud in the still bottomland air. There was no answer. There was no rustle. The corn stayed still. Perry had gotten out of the passenger seat and was walking around the front of the ambulance. He came up beside me. He was holding his own flashlight. He swept it across the corn. He said, "Where did he go?" I said, "Into the corn." He went into the corn. Perry shined his light along the soft dirt at the edge of the shoulder, where the asphalt met the field. The dirt there was loose and damp from a rain we had had the day before. It was the kind of dirt that takes a footprint cleanly. There were no footprints. There were no small barefoot impressions in the dirt. There was no scuff where small feet would have stepped from the asphalt onto the shoulder. The dirt was smooth. Perry looked at me. I looked at him. He did not say anything. He keyed the radio on his shoulder and he called dispatch. The county sent 2 cruisers within 15 minutes. They sent a sheriff's deputy with a tracking dog about a half hour after that. We searched the cornfield for the rest of the night. We started with the row the boy had walked into and we worked outward, in a grid pattern, with the deputies and the dog and Perry and me. We searched both sides of the road for almost a quarter mile in each direction. We found nothing. The dog did not pick up a scent. The dog handler told us, gently, that the dog was not registering anything to track. The sheriff's deputies took my statement and Perry's statement and walked the road for footprints. There were none. The corn between the rows was undisturbed. There were no broken stalks. There were no displaced ears. There was no fabric snagged on any leaf. There was nothing. We searched until the sun came up. The corporate farm office sent somebody out around 6:30, a young woman in a pickup who was very polite and very confused. She told us that there had been no children on the property in the last week. The farm had no full-time residents and no employees who lived nearby. The nearest house, she confirmed, was almost 12 miles up the road in either direction. There was nowhere for a small boy in pajamas to have come from, on foot, in the middle of the night, on a road that had no houses on it. The sheriff's deputies wrote it up. They were kind. They had seen too much over their careers to dismiss what we had told them, but they were also realistic about what could be done. They told us that they would file a report and that they would have somebody check the road again over the next few days, and they would put a note out to the surrounding counties in case any child had been reported missing. No child had been. No child was. The case was closed within a week, marked unfounded. The way calls get marked when there is nothing to follow up on. I am 37 years old now. I am still an EMT. I have moved to a different service in a different county, partly because I wanted a change and partly because I did not want to drive that road at night anymore. Perry retired from emergency services in 2019 and works at a hardware store in our hometown. We do not talk about that night when we see each other, although we see each other from time to time at the grocery store or the gas station, and there is a particular look that passes between us when we say hello, which I think is the look of 2 people who saw the same thing at 3 in the morning and have not been able to put it down. I have thought about the boy many times. I have tried, in the way a trained medical professional tries, to come up with explanations. I have considered the possibility that he was a runaway from a vehicle that had pulled over and driven off, although the math of that does not work, because there were no other cars on the road, and because no parent has ever been identified, and because there were no footprints. I have considered the possibility that I was tired and hallucinating, although Perry saw him too, and Perry was not tired in the same way I was tired. I have considered the possibility that the boy was a real child, who somehow walked into that field from somewhere I cannot account for, and who is still missing, and that we failed him that night by not finding him. That last possibility is the one I have the hardest time with. It is the possibility that wakes me up sometimes at 4 in the morning, with the small blue alarm clock on my nightstand reading 3:40 something, and the room dark, and my heart beating in my throat. It is the possibility that, somewhere, in some form, there is a small barefoot child in pajamas who needed me to follow him into that corn, and to keep following, and that I did not, because I am an adult man trained to wait for the dog and the deputies in the daylight, and that the corn closed over him, and I stood at the edge of the road and called his name into the dark for 20 minutes and did not go in after him. I do not know if that is what happened. I do not know if there was a boy. I have come to believe, in the small, careful way of a man who has spent a lot of his life looking at things he cannot explain, that some children are not the kind of thing you can find by searching. I have come to believe that some of them are walking somewhere we do not have the maps for, and that on certain nights, in certain bottomlands, in certain stands of corn, the line they are walking comes close enough to ours that they can stand for a moment on a yellow line in the middle of a state road in eastern Kentucky and look at us with their small, blank, watchful faces, waiting for us to do something. I do not know what we are supposed to do. I do not know if there is a thing we are supposed to do. I know that I did not do it. I know that the corn closed behind him. I know that every spring, when the corn comes up in the bottomland along that river, I drive the long way home. I had been working as a registered nurse at a regional hospital outside Roanoke for almost 11 years in the autumn of 2018, and I had been working the 3 to 11 shift on the medical surgical floor for the last 6 of those years. I was 41 years old. I had been married to a man named Davis for 14 years, a high school history teacher who had to be at the school by 7:30 in the morning and who, by long arrangement, was usually asleep by the time I got home from my shift. We had no children. We had a small brick house on about 4 acres of land in a rural part of the county, the kind of house people in our part of Virginia call a starter home and then live in for the rest of their lives. My commute from the hospital to the house was about 35 minutes, most of it on a state route that ran through farmland and the occasional patch of woods, and I had been driving it 5 nights a week for 11 years. I knew the road the way you know a road you have driven a couple of thousand times. I knew the curves. I knew the deer crossings. I knew which farmhouses left their porch lights on and which ones did not. I had become, over those years, the kind of driver who could make the trip on a kind of autopilot, the part of my mind that handled the road working separately from the part of my mind that was decompressing from the shift. The bridge I want to tell you about was about 3 miles from my house, on the last leg of my drive home. It was a small 2-lane bridge that crossed a creek called Sour Mill Run, which fed into a larger creek about a 1/4 mile downstream, which fed eventually into the Roanoke River. The bridge had been built by the Works Progress Administration in 1936, and it had a small concrete plaque set into the south end with the date and the WPA insignia on it. It was a single span, maybe 60 feet long, with low concrete walls on either side that came up to about waist height on a standing adult. The bridge had a single lane of cracked asphalt down the middle, with the center line long since worn off. The walls were the original concrete, gray and pitted and softened by 90 years of weather. The creek below the bridge ran through a small wooded hollow with sycamores and willows along the banks. In the autumn, the leaves turned and fell into the creek and made a slow yellow drift down toward the larger water. I had crossed that bridge probably 400 times by the autumn of 2018, going back to the year I had started at the hospital. I had crossed it in summer thunderstorms, with the rain hammering on the roof of my car. I had crossed it in winter snow with my headlights catching on flakes the size of moths. I had crossed it on autumn nights with the smell of wood smoke coming off the farmsteads on either side of the road. I had never thought twice about it. The bridge was a small, uneventful piece of my drive. It was the kind of bridge a person can cross several times a week for 10 years without ever giving it a single conscious thought. It was a Wednesday in mid-October. I had gotten off shift at 11, and I had stayed late at the hospital for about half an hour to finish charting on a patient who had spiked a fever in the last hour of my shift. I had pulled out of the staff parking lot a little before 11:30. The drive home had been quiet. I had the radio on a public station out of Roanoke that played jazz at that hour. The temperature outside was in the low 40s. There had been a clear sky earlier in the evening, but a light fog had come up off the creek bottoms in the last hour. The kind of thin, shifting fog that the lower country in our part of Virginia gets in the autumn, when the days are warm and the nights are cold. The fog was not heavy. It was the kind of fog that pools in the low places and leaves the high places clear. I crossed onto the road that led to the bridge a little before midnight. The road there runs through a few hundred yards of pine forest before it comes out onto a small embankment that leads up to the bridge. There is a slight rise as you come up onto the bridge itself, because the bridge sits a little higher than the road on either side. My headlights swept up over the rise. They caught the gray concrete of the south end of the bridge. They caught the WPA plaque set into the south wall. They caught the cracked asphalt of the single lane. They caught the row of figures standing along the right-hand wall. I want to tell you exactly what I saw, because I have gone over it many times in the last 7 years, and the picture is still as clear as it was that night. There were figures standing along the right-hand wall of the bridge, facing outward, looking down at the creek. They had their backs to me. They were spaced about 3 or 4 feet apart, evenly, the way a row of people lines up at a railing. There were a lot of them. I did not count them in the moment, but I have, in the years since, gone back over the picture in my memory and counted, and I have come up with 12, give or take one. 12 figures, standing along the wall, each of them facing away from the road, each of them looking down at the creek below. They were all the same height. That was one of the first things I noticed. They were not the height of a tall man and the height of a short woman and the height of a child. They were all exactly the same height, somewhere around 5 feet 6, give or take an inch. They were all wearing dark coats. The coats were long, coming down past the hips, made of some heavy dark material that absorbed the light from my headlights without reflecting any of it. The coats had collars turned up. The figures had dark hair, all of them, although I could not tell from behind whether the hair was long or short, because the collars of the coats came up high enough that I could only see the back of each head from about the crown up. The hair was dark. The coats were dark. The hands of the figures, the parts of them I might have been able to see, were not visible. The hands must have been at the wall, or in the pockets of the coats, or down at the sides. I do not know. They did not turn. My headlights hit them squarely. I was driving with the high beams on, the way I drove that road late at night, and the beams swept up over the rise of the bridge and lit the right-hand wall and the row of figures, the way they would light any other thing on the road. The figures did not move. They did not flinch. They did not turn their heads. The headlights had the same effect on them that headlights have on a row of stones along a wall, which is to say no effect at all. I want to tell you what I did. I want to tell you that I slowed down, that I considered the situation carefully, that I decided, with the calm, professional mind of a registered nurse who has been trained to assess situations under pressure, what the appropriate response was. I did not. I did not slow down. I did not speed up. I did not look directly at the figures. I drove across the bridge at exactly the speed I had been driving when I came up onto it, which was about 20 miles an hour, the way you take an old narrow bridge late at night on a wet road. I kept my eyes straight ahead. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. I kept the radio on at the same volume. The bridge is 60 feet long. At 20 miles an hour, a 60-foot bridge takes about 2 seconds to cross. I crossed the bridge. I did not look at the figures as I passed them. I did not turn my head. The peripheral vision of my left eye, the eye on the far side of them, did not register anything. The peripheral vision of my right eye, the eye closer to them, registered a row of dark vertical shapes, evenly spaced, perfectly still, against the gray of the wall and the dark of the creek hollow beyond it. None of the shapes moved as I passed. I came off the north end of the bridge. The road dropped down off the small rise on the other side and turned slightly to the left as it ran along the edge of a pasture. I drove about 100 feet down the road. I checked my rearview mirror. The bridge was empty. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw in the rearview mirror. The mirror showed me the north end of the bridge from the angle I was driving away from it. I could see the gray of the concrete. I could see the right-hand wall, lit faintly by the red glow of my taillights. I could see the cracked asphalt of the single lane. There were no figures standing along the wall. There were no shapes at all on the bridge. The bridge was empty in the way an old bridge is empty when nobody is on it, which is to say absolutely and completely. There was nothing there. I did not stop. I did not slow. I did not turn around. I did not, even in that moment, allow myself to think clearly about what I had seen. I drove the last 3 miles to my house at the same steady speed. I pulled into my driveway. I parked in front of the garage. I got out of the car. I let myself into the house through the side door. I locked the side door behind me, and then I went through every door in the house. The front door, the back door, the door from the kitchen out to the deck, and I checked the locks on each one. I checked the windows. I went into our bedroom, where Davis was asleep, and I stood for a long time at the foot of the bed in my work clothes, watching him breathe. Then I went into the bathroom and I sat on the edge of the tub for a long time, with the light off, until my heart had slowed down. I did not tell Davis. I have not told him in the 7 years since. I have driven over that bridge probably another 400 times since the autumn of 2018. I changed my hours at the hospital about a year later, partly because of a scheduling change, and partly because I did not want to be coming home over that bridge at midnight anymore. And I worked a 7 to 3 shift for 2 years before I went into nursing administration in 2021. I cross the bridge during the day now, mostly, and on the occasional evening when I have stayed late for a meeting, and I have crossed it at night a handful of times when I have been driving home from dinner with friends. I have looked at the right-hand wall of that bridge every single time I have crossed it. Every single time. I do not do it consciously anymore. The looking has become a thing my eyes do without asking the rest of me. I have never seen the figures again. I have looked 400 times. The wall has been empty 400 times. I have thought about it many times. I have tried, in the way a trained medical professional tries, to come up with explanations. I have considered the possibility that I was tired after a long shift and that I imagined the figures, although I do not believe that I imagined them. And although I have spent 11 years working overnight shifts and have never imagined anything before or since, I have considered the possibility that they were a trick of the light, some unusual interaction between my high beams and the fog and the wall, although that does not account for the fact that I saw 12 distinct figures, evenly spaced, all the same height, all wearing dark coats, with dark hair, looking down at the creek. I have considered the possibility that they were people, real people, 12 of them, standing on a bridge at midnight in mid-October, all the same height and all wearing the same kind of coat, looking at the creek for some reason of their own, and that they had walked off the bridge in the 2 seconds it took me to drive across it and check my rearview mirror, although the bridge has nowhere for 12 people to disappear to in 2 seconds, and the road on either side was empty of any other car or any other movement. I have considered all of these explanations seriously. None of them have ever quite fit. I have not, in the years since, asked anybody else if they have seen anything on that bridge. I have wanted to. I have thought, more than once, about going up to my neighbor on the next farm over, an older woman whose family has lived in our valley since the 1870s, and asking her if there is anything I should know about the bridge. I have not done it. I have come to think that it is the kind of question that, once asked, cannot be unasked, and that it is the kind of question that leads to other questions, and that I do not, in the end, want to know the answers. I would rather not know whether other people have seen the figures. I would rather not know how often. I would rather not know what kind of night they tend to appear on, and what kind of night they do not, and whether the autumn nights with the thin fog off the creek bottoms are particularly common nights, and whether there has ever been a person who has stopped on the bridge to look at them more closely, and what happened to that person. I think about them, sometimes. I think about how they were looking down at the creek. I think about how the creek runs through a small wooded hollow with sycamores and willows along the banks, and how in the autumn the leaves fall into the creek and make a slow yellow drift down toward the larger water, and how the creek has been doing that for as long as there has been a creek, and how the bridge has only been there since 1936, which is a short time in the history of a creek. I think about how the figures were facing the creek and not the road. I think about how the road is not what they were looking at. I think about how, before the road was there, and before the bridge was there might have been some other reason to stand at that particular spot and look down at that particular stretch of water, and how that reason might still be there after all these years, even though the people who once had it are not. I will, for the rest of my life, look at the right-hand wall of that bridge every single time I cross it. I look at it during the day, when the wall is sunlit, and the only thing on it is the occasional empty soda bottle somebody has left behind. I look at it at night, in the spill of my own headlights, when the wall is gray and pitted and unmoving. I am looking to make sure the figures have not come back. I am also looking, I think, to make sure I never see them again. Those are not exactly the same thing, and I have learned, over the 7 years since, to live with the small distance between them, and to keep driving, and to keep my eyes forward as I cross, and to check my rearview mirror only after I am safely on the other side. And the summer of 2021, I was 26 years old and trying very hard to start a career. I had finished a graduate program in environmental engineering at a state school in Southern Virginia the previous spring, and I had spent most of the year since then living in a small one-bedroom apartment in a town near the campus, eating a lot of cheap pasta and applying for jobs in 3 states. The work was thin in our part of Virginia. Most of the firms that hired people with my degree were in cities, and I had been driving long distances for interviews all year, sometimes as far as Charlotte and Raleigh and Nashville. In late July, I had gotten a call from a mid-size engineering firm in Knoxville, Tennessee, asking me to come in for a second-round interview. The interview was on a Friday afternoon. I had driven down on Friday morning, done the interview, and then made the kind of decision a young person makes when they are trying to save money and do not entirely think things through, which was that I would drive straight back to my apartment that same night instead of paying for a motel. The interview had run long. I had sat through almost 3 hours of conversations with various engineers and a project manager, followed by a tour of the office, followed by what they called a casual dinner at a barbecue restaurant, which had not been particularly casual and had run until almost 9:30. I had pulled out of the restaurant parking lot at about 9:45, with 2 pulled pork sandwiches in a styrofoam container on the passenger seat and a large iced tea in the cup holder, looking at a 6-hour drive home through the mountains in the dark. I was tired. I was wearing a button-down shirt and slacks that I had been in since 7 that morning. I had a Honda Civic with about 130,000 miles on it, and the gas gauge was somewhere around 3/4 full when I left Knoxville, which I had calculated would get me almost all the way home before I needed to stop. The drive started fine. I took the interstate east, out of Knoxville, climbing up into the mountains, with the radio on a public station and the windows cracked an inch for the cool night air. I passed through Asheville a little after midnight. I picked up the smaller interstate that ran north toward Virginia. I was making decent time. I was tired but not exhausted. I had eaten one of the sandwiches around 11, somewhere outside of Asheville, and the iced tea was keeping me alert. I had been driving long distances all summer for these interviews, and I had become comfortable in the way young people become comfortable with things they should not be comfortable with the rhythm of an overnight drive. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I took a wrong exit. I want to be clear about how that happened, because it is the kind of thing I have thought about many times since. I had been driving on the smaller interstate for about an hour. The road there runs through a stretch of mountains in western North Carolina, with long climbs and long descents, and the occasional section through a notch between 2 ridges. I had been listening to the radio. I had been thinking about the interview. I had been doing the math, in the back of my head, about whether I could afford to take the job if they offered it to me, factoring in the cost of moving and the security deposit on a new apartment and the difference in cost of living between Knoxville and Southern Virginia. I had not been paying close attention to the road signs. There was an exit. The exit number on the sign was for a road that I thought I recognized, a state highway that I had taken a couple of times before, and I took it without really looking at the smaller text underneath. I do not know whether I misread the sign or whether the sign was for a different road than the one I thought it was. I came down the off-ramp and made the turn at the bottom and started driving north on what I assumed was a familiar state highway. I knew, within about 10 minutes, that it was not the road I thought it was. The road I had been on before was a 4-lane divided highway that ran through a series of small mountain towns, with gas stations and motels and the occasional fast food restaurant along the way. The road I was on now was a narrow 2-lane state highway with no shoulder to speak of, running through deep hardwood forest with the trees pressed close on both sides. There were no businesses. There were no houses. There were no cross streets. The road climbed slowly along what I think was the side of a long ridge, although I could not see the country well enough in the dark to be sure. I checked my phone. I had no service. I checked my GPS, which had been working off cached map data because I had not had service for the last 20 miles before the exit. The GPS showed me a blue dot on a road that the map labeled as Old State Route something. I cannot remember the number. The map showed the road running for some distance through what appeared to be national forest land before reconnecting with the interstate further north. I told myself it was fine. I told myself the GPS was showing me a real road that connected to a real interstate. I told myself I would just keep driving, and that I would get back on a highway I recognized within an hour or so, and that the small detour would cost me maybe 45 minutes of drive time. I did not turn around. The road was narrow, and there were no good places to turn around, and I told myself I did not need to. I drove for almost an hour without seeing another car. The road climbed and descended and curved through the forest. The trees on either side were close. The headlights of the Civic pushed out into the dark and caught on the trunks of the trees and on the occasional stretch of guardrail and on the small reflective markers along the edges of the asphalt. There were no signs. There were no mile markers. There were no driveways branching off into the trees. There were no other cars, not in my direction and not in the oncoming lane. The road was simply the road, and the forest was simply the forest, and I drove. The gas gauge dropped slowly. I had been at 3/4 in Knoxville. I had been at half tank at the exit. By the time I had been on the state highway for 50 minutes, I was at a 1/4 tank and dropping. I started to worry. I had not seen any sign of a town in the entire hour I had been on the road. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I checked the GPS. The blue dot was still on the road, still working its way north toward the interstate. But the interstate, on the map, was at least another 40 minutes away. At my current rate of fuel consumption, I was not sure I was going to make it. That was when I saw the sign. It came up on the right-hand side of the road, at the edge of my headlights, set back about 50 feet from the shoulder. It was a tall metal pole sign, the old kind that gas stations used to put up in the 70s, with a fluorescent backlit panel at the top. The panel said truck stop in red letters, and below that diesel food coffee. The lights were on. The panel was glowing. Below the sign, set back from the road behind a wide gravel lot, there was a low rectangular building with lit windows. In front of the building, 2 semis were parked in the long pull-through spaces, their cab lights off, but their running lights faintly visible. I cannot tell you how relieved I was. I pulled in. The lot was packed gravel, the kind of gravel that has been driven over for decades. The pumps were the older kind, with the rotating number wheels rather than digital displays. There were 4 of them, set under a small canopy with fluorescent tubes that hummed audibly in the cool night air. I pulled up to a pump. I got out. I tried my credit card at the pump. The little screen on the pump showed an error message, the way old pumps do when they have not been updated to handle current cards. I left the card and walked toward the building. The building was a single-story rectangle with a flat roof and a glass door at the front. The windows were lit with the soft yellow glow of incandescent bulbs. There was a hand-painted sign on the door that said "Open." I pushed the door. A small bell rang above me as I came in. The inside of the store had not been remodeled in a long time. The walls were paneled in dark brown wood grain laminate, the kind that was popular in the 70s. The floor was linoleum tile in a faded yellow pattern. There were 2 aisles of shelves stocked with snacks and motor oil and travel-sized toiletries, and a wall behind the counter with cigarette displays in front of small mirrored panels. There were 2 large metal coffee urns on a counter to the right of the door, with a stack of styrofoam cups beside them. The cups had a logo printed on them I did not recognize. There was a magazine rack with magazines that, even in the quick glance I gave them as I walked toward the counter, looked old, the kind of magazines that have not been printed in 20 years. The clerk was an older man behind a long wooden counter. He had white hair, combed straight back. He was wearing a short-sleeved button-down shirt with a small logo embroidered on the breast pocket, the same logo as on the cups. He was reading a paperback book. He looked up when the bell rang. He said, in a soft Appalachian voice, "Evening." I told him my card had not worked at the pump. I asked him if I could pay cash. He told me I could. He told me which pump to pull up to, and I went back out to the car, and I moved it to the pump he had pointed me to, and I came back inside with my wallet. I told him $40 on pump 3. He told me he would set it. He pressed a couple of buttons on a console behind the counter. He told me to go pump my gas. I pumped $40 worth of gas. The pump worked the way old pumps work, with the slow rotating wheels and the smell of old gasoline and the small click when the dollars hit 40 and the pump cut off. I went back inside. I gave him 2 20s. He took them and put them in a drawer behind the counter, the kind of drawer that opened with a key. He counted me out a few coins of change, although I cannot now remember why there was change, and he gave me the change in old coins, the kind with the older designs that were minted before the state quarters program had started in the late 90s. The coins felt strange in my palm. I put them in my pocket. I asked him if there was a town nearby with a motel, because I was getting tired and was thinking about getting some sleep. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, in the same soft voice, "Son, you keep on this road, you'll come up to the interstate in about 30 miles. There's a Holiday Inn at the second exit. You drive safe." I thanked him. I went out to the car. I got in. I started the engine. I pulled out of the lot. The 2 semis were still parked in the pull-through spaces. The lights of the truck stop receded in my rearview mirror as I drove on, and within about 30 seconds the trees had closed behind me and the truck stop was gone from sight. I drove for another 40 minutes through the same forest. I came out onto the interstate the man had described, at an exit I did not recognize but that the GPS confirmed. I drove the rest of the way home through the night. I got back to my apartment a little before 6 in the morning. I slept until 2 in the afternoon. I ate the second pulled pork sandwich for a late lunch. I felt fine. The interview, I thought, had gone well. The drive had been long but had been manageable. I had a small story about a wrong exit and a lonely state highway and a tiny old truck stop in the middle of nowhere, the kind of small story you tell as a footnote. 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on my couch with my laptop, looking up the truck stop. I was going to leave a review. The man had been kind. The pumps had worked. The coffee, which I had not bought but had smelled good, had smelled like real coffee. I wanted to find the place online and leave a 5-star review for an older clerk on a back highway who had been good to a tired stranger at 2 in the morning. I could not find it. I tried a map search for truck stops along the route I had taken. The route I had taken, the state highway, did not appear on the map I was looking at. I switched to a different mapping service. The road did not appear on that one either. I zoomed in on the area where I thought I had been. There was no road there. There was a section of national forest with a few logging tracks, but no through road connecting the interstate where I had taken the wrong exit to the interstate where I had come back out 40 minutes later. I called my brother. My brother is 6 years older than I am. He had grown up in western North Carolina before our family had moved to Virginia when I was small. He still knew that part of the country well. I told him about the wrong exit. I told him about the state highway. I told him about the truck stop, and the older clerk, and the 2 semis, and the brown paneling, and the metal coffee urns. I asked him if he knew the place. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me, very carefully, what road I thought I had been on. I told him the name of the old state route the GPS had shown me. He said, in a voice I had not heard him use before, that he wanted me to listen to him for a minute. He told me that there had been a truck stop on a stretch of that old highway in the early 90s when he had been a teenager. He had stopped there a few times with our father on long drives. He said the description I had given him, the brown paneling, the cigarette wall, the coffee urns, the layout, was the truck stop he remembered. He said the older clerk I had described, the white hair combed back, the soft voice, the embroidered shirt, sounded like a man named Mr. Whitener, who had run the place for years. He said Mr. Whitener had died sometime in the early 90s, before the truck stop had burned down. He said the truck stop had burned down in the late summer of 1994. There had been an electrical fire, late at night, in the back office. Nobody had been hurt. The building had been a total loss. The owners had not rebuilt. The state had bypassed that section of the old highway the following year, and had decommissioned the old route in 1996, and it had been growing back to forest ever since. The road, he told me, was no longer a road. It had not been a road in 25 years. I did not say anything for a long time. My brother told me, in his careful voice, that he was not sure what I had driven on, or where I had bought my gas, or who I had given my $40 to. He told me he was glad I had made it home. He told me, in the way an older brother tells a younger brother things, that I should not, under any circumstances, try to find that exit again. I have not. I took the job in Knoxville, and I moved that fall, and I drove the route from Southern Virginia to Knoxville maybe a dozen more times that year, and I never again missed the exit. I am 31 years old now. I work for the same firm. I have a family. I have made the drive many times, both directions, in every season. I have never seen a sign for the old state route. I have never seen the exit. I have never, since that night, seen any indication that the road exists. I still have the change. I put it in a small dish on my dresser when I had gotten home that morning, and I forgot about it for a while, and then when I remembered it, I did not want to spend it. I have moved twice since then. The change has moved with me. It is in a small ceramic dish on the dresser in my bedroom. There are 3 coins. They have older designs on them. The dates on them, when I look at them, are all from before 1994. They feel cold in a way that other coins do not. I do not, anymore, take them out and look at them. I look at them in the dish, sometimes, when I am putting on my watch in the morning. I think, sometimes, about Mr. Whitener, behind his long wooden counter, in his clean short-sleeved shirt, telling a tired stranger to drive safe. I hope, in whatever small way it is possible to hope such a thing, that he is doing all right wherever he is, and that the 2 semis I saw in his lot are still parked there, and that he has somebody to talk to in the long, quiet hours between cars on a road that nobody is driving anymore. I do not know if that is the right thing to hope. I have not been able to come up with a better one. I had been a long-haul driver for almost 15 years in the winter of 2013, running mostly the eastern corridor between the Carolinas and Ohio for a mid-size freight company out of Charlotte. I was 46 years old. I had 2 grown sons in the Army, a wife of 23 years named Linda who worked as a school secretary in our small town outside Charlotte, and a beagle named Pete who slept on the foot of our bed. I had been driving the Charlotte to Cincinnati run for almost 8 years by then, 2 or 3 times a month, hauling mostly mixed freight on a route that took me up through the western Carolinas, across a corner of East Tennessee, and into Ohio through the eastern Kentucky hill country. I knew the route. I knew the truck stops. I knew the way stations, and which scales were usually open at what hours, and which county sheriffs in Kentucky were patient with truckers, and which ones were not. I had settled, by 2013, into the long, quiet rhythm of a driver who has done his route enough times that the road itself becomes a kind of furniture in his life. The shortcut I want to tell you about was an old federal highway that cut through a section of the mountains in eastern Kentucky. The main route my company used ran the interstate the whole way, but the interstate took a long looping arc through the Cumberland Gap and added almost an hour to the run compared to the old highway. The old highway ran more or less straight up through the hills along the path of an even older 19th century road, with a posted speed limit of 55, and the kind of long sweeping grades that a loaded semi can take comfortably if the driver knows what he is doing. I had been taking that shortcut for almost 10 years. My company did not officially endorse it, but they did not officially forbid it either, and most of the senior drivers used it on the Cincinnati run when the weather was clear. I had taken it, by my own count, somewhere between 60 and 80 times. The road had mile markers. The mile markers on a federal highway count up from the southern terminus of the road to the northern terminus, the way mile markers do on most American highways. On the section I drove, heading north toward the Ohio River, the markers counted up from somewhere in the low 20s at the southern end of the route I picked it up on, climbed slowly through the 40s and 50s as I went up through the hill country, and reached somewhere in the mid-80s by the time I came out at the northern end and got back on the interstate. I had used the markers, over the years, the way every driver uses them, as a quiet reference for where I was on the road. By 2013, I knew them the way I knew the rooms of my own house. I knew that marker 38 was at the bottom of a long climb. I knew that marker 52 was at a small pull-off where I sometimes stopped to stretch my legs. I knew that marker 68 was near a closed-down country store with a faded Coca-Cola sign that I always glanced at, for some reason even though there was nothing there to see. The night I want to tell you about was a Tuesday in mid-February. The temperature outside was in the low 20s, cold enough that I had the heat on high in the cab and was driving with my window cracked maybe a half inch for the air. There had been a light snow the night before, but the road had been plowed and salted and was clear. The sky was clear. There was a half moon up that I had been watching off and on through my windshield as I climbed up out of Tennessee and into the Kentucky hills. I had picked up the shortcut at a little before 2:30 in the morning. I had been driving for about 10 hours. I had a thermos of coffee. I had the radio on a country station out of London, Kentucky. Very quiet. I came past mile marker 47 at a few minutes after 3. I did not, in the moment, pay particular attention to it. The marker was where it always was, on the right shoulder, a small green sign with the white reflective number on it, glowing faintly in the spill of my headlights. I noted it, the way a driver notes mile markers, without giving it any thought. I had been at marker 46 about a minute before, and I would be at marker 48 about a minute later. The road was familiar. The truck was warm. The radio was low. About a minute later, I came past the next marker. I read it without thinking. Then I read it again, because the part of my brain that watches mile markers had registered that something was off. The marker said 46. I had just passed 47. I should have been looking at 48. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things when you are alone in a cab at 3 in the morning and have been driving for 10 hours, that I had misread the previous marker. I had probably seen 45 and read it as 47. The lighting on the markers was not always perfect, and I had been tired, and the human eye is not infallible. I checked my speedometer. I was doing 55, the speed I always did on that road. I checked my mirrors. The road behind me was empty. I checked my fuel gauge. Half tank. I told myself I had misread. A minute later, I came past the next marker. It said 45. I sat with my hands on the wheel, and I watched the road in my headlights. The road was the same road. The asphalt was the same asphalt. The shoulders were the same shoulders. The trees on either side were the same kind of bare hardwoods I had been driving past for the last 20 minutes. The road climbed and curved gently the way it always did at that section. The half moon was still in the sky. I could see, over the next ridge, the faint glow of a single radio tower with its red lights blinking, the way it always did. A minute later, I came past the next marker. It said 44. I cannot tell you the exact thought that went through my head at that moment, because I am not sure I had a thought. The part of me that had been driving the truck simply kept driving the truck. The part of me that was watching the markers had gone very still, the way an animal goes still when it senses a thing it does not yet understand. I did not slow down. I did not speed up. I drove. I watched the next marker come up out of the dark, and it said 43. And I watched the one after that, and it said 42. The markers were counting down. They were coming up at the same intervals they always did. They were the same green signs with the same white reflective numbers. They were correct in every way, except for the direction they were counting in, which was wrong. I want to tell you that I considered turning around. I did. I considered making a U-turn, or pulling into the next pull-off and turning the truck around, and going back the way I had come. I did not do it. The road was narrow. The shoulders were narrow. The truck was loaded. There was nowhere good to turn around. And I had a delivery in Cincinnati at 8 in the morning, and I was 30 miles into a 60-mile shortcut, and the sensible thing, I told myself, was to keep driving until the markers started counting up again, the way they were supposed to. I drove past 41. I drove past 40. I drove past 39. Around marker 36 or 35, I started to notice that the road outside the windshield was starting to look wrong. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it is the part I have the hardest time with. The road did not change suddenly. There was no moment where I came around a bend and saw a different landscape. The change was small and gradual, and it took me several minutes to realize it was happening. The trees on either side of the road were too close. The shoulders, which on the actual federal highway were wide enough for a truck to pull off comfortably, had narrowed to maybe 2 feet of gravel before the woods began. The trees themselves were taller than the trees I was used to seeing on that section of the road, and they were closer together, and they were the wrong kind of trees. In some way, I could not have explained, even at the time. They were hardwoods, but they were too straight, and they grew too uniformly, the way trees grow in a forest that has not been logged in a very long time. The asphalt was too smooth. The federal highway I had been driving for 10 years had cracks in it, and patches, and the small, uneven texture of a road that had been plowed and salted through 40 winters. The asphalt I was driving on now was smooth and dark, the way a road is smooth and dark when it has been freshly paved. The sky above me had no stars. I noticed that around marker 33, I had been watching the road and the markers, and I had not looked up at the sky for a few minutes, and when I did look up, through the top of my windshield, the sky was simply black. There was no moon. There were no stars. There was no faint glow of any town anywhere on any horizon. The sky above the road was the kind of black you do not see in any settled country in America. It was the black of a sky with nothing in it. Marker 32 came up. Marker 31 came up. The road kept going. The trees kept being too close. The asphalt kept being too smooth. The sky kept being too dark. At marker 30, I pulled over. I did not make a decision to pull over. My foot came off the gas and onto the brake before I had decided anything, and I steered the truck toward the narrow gravel shoulder, and I came to a stop with the engine still running and my hazard lights blinking. I sat in the cab. I looked at the dashboard. I looked at my hands on the wheel. I did not look out the windshield. I did not look out the side window. I reached forward and turned off the engine. The cab went quiet, except for the small ticking of the cooling diesel and the soft tick of the hazards. I closed my eyes. I want to tell you that I prayed. I am not a religious man. I had not been to church since my mother had died in 2007, but I closed my eyes, and I sat in the cab with my hands on the wheel and the seatbelt still across my chest, and I said, in my head, the small handful of words a man says when he has run out of better ideas. I asked, of nobody in particular, to be left alone. I asked to be allowed to wake up in a place I recognized. I asked, I think, mostly that I be allowed to see Linda again, and Pete and my sons, and that whatever I was sitting in the middle of would not be the last thing I saw. I sat that way for a long time. I do not know exactly how long. I did not check my watch. I did not look up. I kept my eyes closed and my hands on the wheel, and my mind on the small handful of words and the small pictures of the people I loved. After a while, I noticed that the cab was getting warm. I noticed that there was a soft pinkish light coming through my closed eyelids. I noticed that there were, somewhere outside, the small, early morning sounds of birds. I opened my eyes. The sun was coming up. The sky over the road in front of me was a pale pink gray, with thin streaks of cloud. The half moon was gone. The trees on either side of the road were the bare hardwoods I had been driving past for the last 10 years on that route, with their normal spacing and their normal heights. The asphalt was the cracked and patched asphalt of a federal highway in eastern Kentucky in February. The shoulders were wide. There were small drifts of dirty snow along the edges of the gravel. There were 2 crows in a tree about 50 feet ahead of me, calling back and forth. The mile marker beside my truck, on the right shoulder, was a small green sign with white reflective numbers. It said 72. I sat in the cab for a long time looking at it. I had been at marker 47 when the count had started going wrong. I had pulled over at marker 30. The marker beside me said 72, 42 miles up the road from where I had stopped. The sun was up. My watch said it was a little before 7 in the morning. I had pulled over a few minutes after 3. I started the engine. I put the truck in drive. I pulled back out onto the road. I drove the rest of the way to Cincinnati. I made my delivery at 8. The dispatcher at the receiving warehouse told me I looked like hell. I told him I had not slept well. He gave me a cup of coffee and let me sit in his break room for a while before I started the run back. I have not taken that shortcut again. I drove the Charlotte to Cincinnati run for another 4 years, until I retired from long haul in 2017, and I took the interstate every single time, the long looping arc through the Cumberland Gap, even though it added an hour to the run. My dispatcher noticed. He asked me about it once. I told him I had gotten cautious in my old age. He let it go. He was a decent man. I have not told Linda. I have not told my sons. I have told one person, a man named Roy McAfee, who had been a senior driver at our company for 30 years and who retired the year before I did. We had a beer together at his retirement party. Roy is the kind of man who, after 30 years of long haul, has a face that does not surprise easily. He listened to my story. He drank his beer. When I was done, he set the beer down and he looked at me and he said, in his slow Carolina voice, that he had taken that shortcut for years too, and that he had stopped taking it sometime in the late 90s, and that he did not, when I asked him why, want to talk about it. He said he was glad I was all right. He said he hoped I had stopped taking it for good. I have. I do not know what road I was on between marker 47 and marker 30. I know it was not the road I had been driving for 15 years. I know that for 45 minutes, on a Tuesday morning, in February of 2013, I was driving on a road that counted backwards, under a sky with no stars, between trees that were too close, on asphalt that was too smooth, and that the only thing I did right was to pull over and close my eyes and wait for the sun to come up. I do not know if I would have come out of it if I had kept driving. I do not know what was at the end of marker 0 or marker -1, or wherever the road I was on was leading. I do not know whether the road is still there, on certain nights, between marker 47 and marker 30, waiting for the next driver who has been doing his route long enough to stop paying attention. I am 61 years old now. I am retired. I sit on my porch in the evenings with Linda and Pete, and I drink a single beer, and I watch the sun go down over the small piece of country where we have lived for 30 years, and I am, in the small, careful way of a man who has come back from a place he should not have been, grateful. I am grateful for the porch. I am grateful for Linda. I am grateful for the beagle. I am grateful, most of all, for the eyes I closed in the cab of a truck on a winter night in eastern Kentucky, and for whatever it was that opened them again, and for the marker that read 72 when I did.